Hello everyone. Welcome to Frightening Tales. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep. So, before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright, now let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's case. Story 1. Breaking news tonight, the return of Top Mai. I feel that it's necessary if I'm going to continue to operate appropriately as a legal advocate that I start to advocate for myself and also advocate for my daughter. Who would have thought that this woman, once labeled as America's most hated, would now call herself a legal expert, fighting for the very child she was accused of killing. Not only were traces of chloroform found in the trunk of her car, but that her laptop computer showed she searched the internet. For 31 days, she didn't report her daughter missing. The jury finds the defendant not guilty, but I also couldn't exclude the possibility of it being an accident, so I can't find her guilty of a crime if I'm not sure a crime was committed. 14 years after being acquitted of her daughter's murder, Casey Anthony is back in the spotlight. But this time, she's playing a whole new role. I feel that it's important that I use this platform that was thrust upon me and now look at it as a blessing as opposed to the curse that it has been since 2008. If you think she's innocent, drop a comment below. But make sure to come back after hearing the full story because even Gypsy Rose Blanchard, who killed her own mom over abuse, doesn't think she's innocent. But before we talk about her latest move, let's go back, way back to see how a seemingly ordinary young woman became the center of one of the most controversial murder trials in modern history. This call started it all. It was the moment that would unravel the case of Kay Anthony, the 2-year-old girl who vanished without a trace. But what made it even more disturbing was that her own mother, Casey Anthony, never reported her missing. Instead, for an entire month, she lived her life as if nothing had happened. Partying, hanging out with friends, and even getting a tattoo that read meaning beautiful life. Meanwhile, Kay was nowhere to be found. Eventually, Casey claimed that Kay had been kidnapped by her nanny, Zani the nanny. But as investigators dug deeper, they realized this so-called nanny didn't even exist. It was just one of the many lies Casey told throughout the investigation. So, what really happened? How did Kay go missing? And more importantly, how did Casey walk free despite all the evidence pointing to her guilt? For starters, Casey Marie Anthony was born on March 16, 1986 in Warren, Ohio to George and Cindy Anthony. She grew up in a middle-class home alongside her older brother Lee Anthony. And from the outside looking in, her life seemed normal. Her father was a former police officer before working in security, while her mother was a home care nurse. But even as a child, Casey had a troubling pattern of lying. And we're not just talking about harmless little fibs. People who knew her recalled how she would lie for no apparent reason, even when the truth was obvious. If she was caught doing something, she'd deny it. If she was confronted with evidence, she'd spin a new story. It wasn't just deception. It was habitual dishonesty that would later become the backbone of the case against her. As Casey grew older, her lying escalated. In high school, she began distancing herself from her family, keeping them in the Dark about her personal life. She was known to be social and outgoing, but she was also secretive. Her parents later admitted they had no idea who her real friends were, who she was dating, or what she was doing when she wasn't home. And then came one of the first major lies, her fake high school graduation. Now, Casey let her parents believe she had enough credits to graduate high school. They planned a celebration for her, invited friends and family, and were ready to cheer her on. But there was just one problem. She hadn't actually graduated. She had failed to complete the necessary credits, but never told anyone until the last minute. Her parents were shocked. But this was only the beginning. Rather than finishing high school, Casey made a different choice. She dropped out altogether. Soon after, she claimed she had secured a job at Universal Studios, working at the Hard Rock Cafe. Every day she would leave home as if heading to work, return in the evening, and casually discuss her supposed co-workers, customers, and experiences. She painted a picture of a young woman, excited about her job, seemingly happy and independent. By January 2005, Casey's life took a seemingly positive turn when she met Jesse Grund, a young man she quickly fell in love with. To the outside world, things were looking up for her. She had a steady job, a new boyfriend, and appeared to be on a stable path. But later that year, at just 19 years old, Casey found out she was pregnant. This revelation threw her into a state of uncertainty. She confided in friends that she wasn't sure if she wanted to keep the baby. Adoption seemed like an option. She could continue living her carefree lifestyle without the responsibility of motherhood. However, months passed and she kept the pregnancy a secret from her parents. It wasn't until she was 7 months pregnant that Casey could no longer hide the truth. Even then, she insisted she was considering adoption, but Cindy and George Anthony were outraged at the thought. They refused to let her give the baby up, insisting that their grandchild would be part of the family no matter what. With her parents unwilling to entertain the idea of adoption, Casey's fate as a mother was sealed. On August 9, 2005, Casey Anthony gave birth to a baby girl, Kay Marie Anthony. From the moment she was born, Kay became the light of the Anthony family's life, especially to Cindy, who took on a maternal role in raising her granddaughter. And this is where Casey would add even more lies to her life. Casey initially told Jesse Grund that he was the father, and he fully embraced the role, preparing to raise Kay as his own. However, when a paternity test was later conducted, it turns out that Jesse was not the father. This left a major question mark over Kay's true parentage. Over the years, Casey offered multiple versions of the story. She claimed at one point that the father had died in a car accident, but there was never any confirmation of such a person existing. Some speculated that the father could have been a former boyfriend or even someone unknown to Casey's closest friends and family. Despite the mystery surrounding Kay's biological father, Cindy and George never pressed Casey for the truth. Their focus was on Kay herself, and in their eyes, she was part of the family regardless of who her father was. Many people who later followed Casey's case weren't as concerned about who the father was, but rather why she constantly lied about it. She seemed incapable of telling the truth about even the simplest details, making it difficult for anyone to trust a word that came out of her mouth. One of the strangest decisions the Anthony family made during this time was keeping Casey's pregnancy a secret, even from her own brother, Lee. Lee, who lived in the same house, had no idea his sister was expecting until just a few days before she gave birth. When he finally learned the truth, he was furious. He couldn't understand why his parents had kept such a major life event from him, especially when he and Casey had always been relatively close. The betrayal ran so deep that he refused to go to the hospital when Casey delivered Kay. Now, as a new mother, Casey also introduced a nanny into the picture, Zany, whose full name she claimed was Zenata Fernandez Gonzalez. According to Casey, Zany was an ex-girlfriend of a man named Jeff, an IT worker from Universal Studios. And Jeff had even been the one to pay for Kay's child care. Casey's parents, Cindy and George, found this arrangement bizarre. Why would a stranger be covering the cost of babysitting their granddaughter? But despite their concerns, they never actually met Zany. Cindy would later recall that Kay did talk about Zany and her dog, which seemed to add some credibility to the story. But something wasn't right. No one in the family had ever seen Zany, met her, or even knew where she lived. To them, she was just a name, a ghostly figure that only Casey seemed to know. And soon, suspicions would grow even stronger. During this time, Jesse Gruand, the man Casey had claimed was Kayle's father, was ready to commit fully to their little family. He proposed to Casey and she accepted, seemingly eager to embrace this new chapter in her life. As mentioned earlier, a DNA test revealed that Jesse was not Kayle's biological father. But despite the painful revelation, Jesse still wanted to be there for Kay and work things out with Casey. He had grown attached to the little girl and was ready to raise her as his own. However, by May 2006, Jesse began noticing troubling changes in Casey's behavior. She had become distant, erratic, and dishonest. She wasn't the same person he had fallen in love with, and he could no longer ignore the red flags. Feeling confused and frustrated, Jesse ended their engagement. But rather than grieving the end of her relationship, Casey quickly embraced the party scene. She started going out more, drinking, dancing, and spending nights at clubs, all while her parents took care of Kay at home. Cindy and George provided their granddaughter with everything she needed: food, clothing, and a stable environment, while Casey appeared more focused on having fun than being a responsible mother. During one of her nights out, Casey met Tony Lazaro, an aspiring DJ. The two began dating almost immediately, and Casey started spending more and more time at Tony's apartment, which he shared with roommates. Sometimes she even brought Kay along. Despite having a new boyfriend and a seemingly fresh start, Casey still lived at home with her parents, who remained the primary caregivers for Kay. In many ways, Cindy and George were more like Kayle's parents than Casey was. They were the ones who made sure she was fed, clothed, and taken care of. However, on June 15, 2008, a heated argument erupted within the family. The following morning, Casey left with Kay for what she claimed was a work trip to Tampa, Florida. She packed a bag as if she intended to stay away for a while. But surprise, this was just one of her lies. Because, as it turns out, she never went to Tampa at all. Instead, she spent the next few weeks partying, staying with her boyfriend, and living as if nothing had happened. Meanwhile, Kay was nowhere to be seen, and every time someone asked about her, Casey had a different excuse. Cindy frequently called to check on Kay, only to receive evasive responses, such as, "She's with the nanny, Zani," or "She's sleeping." As the weeks passed, Kay's grandparents grew deeply concerned. During this time, Casey's began partying more than ever, drinking almost every night and even participating in a sexy body contest at a local club. Since her boyfriend was a DJ, she followed him wherever he performed. MySpace was popular at the time, and Casey posted pictures of herself out partying, dancing on bar tops, and seemingly living her best life. She even got a tattoo that read Bella, meaning beautiful life. On top of that, Casey's parents had lent her their car since she did not have one of her own. They wanted to ensure she had transportation, believing she needed it for work. However, one day, Casey drove to a cashing place and ran out of gas, leaving her stranded. Instead of calling for help or asking her parents for assistance, she abandoned the car in the parking lot. Eventually, employees at the check cashing business noticed the vehicle sitting there for an extended period and called a tow truck. The car was impounded and the authorities contacted Casey's father, George, informing him that the family's vehicle had been towed. Confused and frustrated, George went to retrieve the car, only to be met with an overwhelming and sickening odor when he opened the door. The toll lot employee accompanying him immediately remarked that the stench resembled that of a decomposing body. Though George had never encountered such a smell before, he instinctively knew something was terribly wrong. George brought the car home, still disturbed by the awful odor. When his wife Cindy smelled it, she too was alarmed. The couple opened the trunk and discovered a trash bag inside. But instead of inspecting its contents, they threw it away and attempted to mask the lingering stench by spraying an entire bottle of frizz inside the car and leaving the doors open to air it out. Because of these, they were furious. Not only had Casey abandoned the vehicle, forcing them to pay to retrieve it, but she had also remained silent about it. They had so many unanswered questions. Why had she left the car there? How had she been getting around? And most importantly, where was Kay? Desperate for answers, Cindy tried calling Casey multiple times, but her daughter refused to pick up. Left with no other choice, Cindy drove to Casey's boyfriend's apartment to confront her directly. When she arrived, she was met with an unsettling scene. Drug paraphernalia scattered throughout the living room despite it being early in the day. Cindy demanded to know where Kay was, but Casey simply repeated that she was with the nanny, Zani. Frustrated and fed up, Cindy insisted that Casey come home with her immediately. Casey, irritated and embarrassed by her mother's sudden intrusion, especially in front of her boyfriend, reluctantly agreed. Back at the family home, Cindy reached her breaking point. She called 911 and reported Casey for stealing the car and abandoning it. But what she said next sent chills down the dispatcher's spine. Cindy also reported that her 3-year-old granddaughter had been missing for a month. And as Cindy waited for the police to arrive, she overheard Casey talking to her brother Lee. Casey claimed she had met the nanny at a park to drop off Kay. But when she arrived, Zani allegedly grabbed the child, refused to return her, and disappeared. Horrified by what she was hearing, Cindy called 911 again, this time to report a possible kidnapping. In the second call, she frantically told the dispatcher that she had just learned her granddaughter had been taken and had been missing for an entire month. But it was the third 911 call that truly conveyed the gravity of the situation. I told you my daughter was missing for a month. I just found her today, but I can't find my granddaughter. She just admitted to me that she's been trying to find her herself. There's something wrong. I found my daughter's car today, and it smells like there's been a dead body in the damn car. Okay. What is the 3-year-old's name? K. C. Anthony. Kaylee. Anthony. Yes. How long has she been missing for? I have not seen her since the 7th of June. Is your daughter there? Can I speak with her? Hello. Hello. Yes. Can you tell me what's going on a little bit? I'm sorry. Can you tell me a little bit what's going on? My daughter's been missing for the last 31 days. And you know who has her? I know. Who has her? I've tried to contact her. I actually received a phone call today now from a number that is no longer in service. I did get to speak to my daughter for about a minute. Who is her? Do you have a name? When officers arrived at the Anthony home, they pressed K for information. She claimed she knew exactly who had K, the nanny, Zenita Fernandez Gonzalez. K stated that Zenita had been Kale's babysitter for months, was a former co-worker from Universal Studios, and was a mix of black and Puerto Rican. The police requested that K take them to the last place she saw Zani. She led them to the Saras apartments, pointing out an apartment where she claimed Zani had lived. But when officers checked with the apartment management, they discovered that no one had lived in that unit since March. Suspicions deepened when surveillance footage failed to show any sign of the so-called nanny. By this point, investigators were certain that Casey Anthony was lying. So, determined to expose the truth, police started digging into her claims. One of the first major red flags was Casey's supposed job at Universal Studios. She had repeatedly told friends, family, and now law enforcement that she worked there. But when police checked, they found out the shocking truth. Casey had never worked at Universal Studios. In reality, she had been fired long ago, but kept up the charade, telling everyone she still had a job. But rather than confronting her outright, the detectives played along. They took Casey to Universal Studios and asked her to lead them to her boss. Without hesitation, she confidently walked through security into the employee entrance and into the office area as if she knew exactly where she was going. But as they wandered through the maze of offices, it became clear she was stalling, leading them in circles with nowhere to go. With Casey's credibility in shambles, police arrested her on July 16, 2008, and charged her with child neglect, obstruction of justice, and making false statements. Meanwhile, her mother, Cindy Anthony, sat down with detectives and dropped another bombshell. She revealed that when she had retrieved Casey's abandoned car from the impound lot, it reeked of death. Inside the trunk, she found trash, a rotting pizza box filled with maggots, and a stench so overwhelming that she initially thought something or someone had died inside. But instead of Admitting the obvious, Cindy tried to dismiss it, insisting that the smell was just rotting pizza. However, detectives weren't buying it. They reminded her that on her own 911 call, she had explicitly stated, "It smells like a dead body." Yet, she kept backtracking, desperately trying to cling to the idea that it was just decomposing food. 2. Settle the matter, forensic investigators searched Casey's car. They brought in cadaver dogs trained to detect the scent of human decomposition. When the dogs reached the trunk, they went absolutely crazy, signaling that they had picked up the undeniable scent of a dead body. Further inspection revealed a small stain on the trunk liner, one eerily the size of a small body. Investigators removed the trunk carpet for testing, and the results were evidence of human decomposition and an alarmingly high level of chloroform, a substance that can be used to render someone unconscious. And there was more. Inside the trunk, forensic experts found a single hair. Through mitochondrial DNA testing, they determined that the hair belonged to someone in the Anthony family, either Cindy, Casey, or Kay. But there was one crucial clue that sealed the deal. The hair was long, untreated, and had something known as a decomposition band, a dark marking that forms on hair when a person's body begins to decompose. Given the characteristics of the hair, it could only belong to Kay. But Casey's lies didn't stop there. Investigators seized the family's home computer, hoping to uncover more evidence. And what they found was jaw-dropping. Someone had searched how to make chloroform. This wasn't just some random internet click. It was a direct, deliberate search. When detectives confronted Cindy about it, she came up with yet another bizarre excuse. She claimed she had been researching chlorophyll because her dogs had been eating bamboo and she wanted to see if it was toxic. And then came the final nail in the coffin. Cindy wasn't even home when the search was made. It was proven that Casey was the only person at the house when the computer was used to look up chloroform. So why was Cindy going out of her way to cover for her daughter? Investigators believed she knew more than she was letting on. But whether it was out of denial, guilt, or misplaced loyalty, she wasn't giving Casey up. In a desperate attempt to get more answers, Cindy went to visit Casey in jail. She asked her straight up what Zani looked like. After all, Casey had told everyone that Zani the nanny had kidnapped Kay. But as it turns out, Zani the nanny never existed. The woman Casey had blamed for Kale's disappearance was a complete fabrication. Yes, there was a real Zenata Gonzalez, an innocent woman who happened to share the name. But Casey had never met her. The whole story was a smoke screen. Another one of Casey's carefully crafted deceptions who doesn't care and doesn't want to help because she's afraid that something so heinous happened that everyone's going to look at her and say, she's a monster. She deserves to go away. She deserves to never see the light of day. This bad thing should happen to her. I don't want to believe that right now, but you're giving me no choice. You understand? You're giving me no choice. This is going to be the opportunity that you have right now. No matter how heinous you think that what happened was to Kay, this is your opportunity to tell us. This is going to be your only opportunity to tell us because what's going to happen, we're going to find out. There's not going to be a question. We're going to find out. We've got so many resources on this right now. Just like I told you what happened. What we're trying to do is prove your story. But everything that we've done is disproving your story. Every single thing. Everything you've told us, we've shown you have lied about it. Casey has lied about it. And we're looking for your child. We've got to throw these lies out. All these lies are out. We know that everything you've told us is a lie. Tell us what happened to Kay. Tell us what happened to Kay. I dropped off Kay. That's the last time that I've seen her. I dropped her off. Where did you drop her off? I dropped her off at that apartment. No, you didn't. That's exactly where I dropped her off. And who did you drop her off to? With Sanita? No, you didn't. She was the last person. No, that's not true. Did Zainata give you any money that day? No, I would not have sold my daughter. If I wanted to really just get rid of her, I would have left her with my parents and I would have left. I would have moved out. I would have given my mom custody. On December 11, 2008, less than a mile from the Anthony family home, a utility worker named Roy Crone was out doing his routine rounds when he noticed something unusual. In the woods, about 20 feet off the road, he spotted what appeared to be a small skull. At first, he thought it was just another piece of trash, but when he poked it with a stick, he realized it was something far more sinister, a child's skull. He immediately called 911. Shockingly, this wasn't the first time Crone had tried to report this discovery. He had actually called the police 3 times before, months earlier, saying that something in the area looked suspicious. But his calls were dismissed, and no one took him seriously. This time when law enforcement arrived, they found more than just a skull. Scattered around the area were the remains of a small child, bones placed inside a trash bag, and next to them, a laundry bag. What stood out the most was a baby blanket decorated with Winnie the Pooh and Piglet, a haunting clue that would later tie everything back to the Anthony household. On December 19, 2008, DNA results confirmed what everyone had feared. The remains belonged to Kay Anthony, the little girl who had been reported missing in July. Had been just minutes away from home the entire time. Investigators immediately obtained a warrant to search the Anthony home, and what they found further incriminated Casey. Inside the house, they found an identical laundry bag sold only in pairs, meaning the one found with Kayle's remains had undoubtedly come from the Anthony home. They also discovered that Kayle's bedroom had been Winnie the Pooh themed, perfectly matching the blanket found with her body. With this damning evidence, prosecutors built their case, and Casey Anthony was formally charged with first-degree murder along with aggravated child abuse, aggravated manslaughter of a child, and 4 counts of lying to law enforcement. Prosecutors announced they would be seeking the death penalty, believing Casey had intentionally killed her daughter. By the time the trial began on May 24, 2011, the nation was watching. Jose Baez, Casey's defense attorney, threw a shocking curveball in his opening statement. He claimed that Kay had not been murdered at all. Instead, he argued that Kay had accidentally drowned in the family pool on June 16, 2008, and that Casey's father, George Anthony, helped cover it up. Baez even accused George of sexually abusing Casey. claiming that years of trauma had shaped her into a compulsive liar. The defense's theory: Casey never killed Kay. She was simply conditioned to lie because of her abusive upbringing. The prosecution, however, painted a very different picture. They argued that Casey had murdered her daughter because she wanted to be free from motherhood. They presented photos of Casey partying, drinking, and entering hot body contests in the days following Kay's disappearance, showing no signs of distress. They also emphasized the duct tape found on Kay's skull, suggesting that Kay had been suffocated deliberately, but without a clear cause of death. The case rested heavily on circumstantial evidence. Throughout the trial, the jury heard testimony from forensic experts, Casey's former friends, and her own family. George Anthony denied all allegations of sexual abuse and insisted he had nothing to do with Kay's death. Casey's former best friend testified that Casey had never even mentioned Kay being missing, acting as if nothing had happened. Jailhouse phone calls between Casey and her parents were played, and Casey's cold, detached attitude made her look even more suspicious. When it came time for closing arguments, prosecutors urged the jury to see the truth that Casey had killed Kay so she could live a carefree life. They called her a pathological liar who fabricated elaborate stories instead of reporting her daughter missing. The defense, on the other hand, reminded the jury that there was no direct evidence of murder, no fingerprints, no eyewitnesses, no clear cause of death. Then on July 5, 2011, after just 10 hours of deliberation, the jury reached their verdict. The entire country held its breath as the decision was read. Verdict is to count 3. The jury find the defendant not guilty. So say we all dated at Orlando, Orange County, Florida, this 5th day of July, 2011. Signed for person. As to the charge of providing false information to a law enforcement officer, verdict is to count 4. We the jury find the defendant guilty of providing false information to a law enforcement officer, as charged in the indictment. So say we all dated at Orlando, Orange County, Florida this 5th day of July 2011. Signed for person. The decision was read. The verdict shocked the nation. Many believed Casey had gotten away with murder while others argued that the prosecution had failed to prove how Kay died. But one thing was certain. Casey Anthony had become one of the most hated women in America. On July 17, 2011, Casey walked out of jail a free woman, having already served time for her false statements to police. But freedom came at a cost. She would never escape the public's wrath. Crowds screamed at her, calling her a murderer. Protesters lined the streets demanding justice for Kay. Now, if you think Casey Anthony would be out there depressed, drowning in guilt, or tormented by public outrage, think again. Despite the world labeling her as a murderer, despite the loss of her child, she didn't shed a single tear of distress in public. She moved on as if nothing had happened. In March 2017, Casey gave her first interview since the trial to the Associated Press. In a series of articles, she admitted to lying to the police and acknowledged the public's hatred toward her. But understanding doesn't mean she cared. Because if anything, Casey seemed perfectly fine living with the infamy. By December 2020, Casey was making moves again. This time filing paperwork to start her own private investigation business in South Florida. Her family claimed the business was meant to investigate Kayle's death, but a source told People magazine that wasn't the case. That's a closed chapter in her life. The source revealed she's not starting a company to get answers about Kay. In other words, she wasn't looking for justice. She was looking for profit. Then in November 2022, Casey re-emerged for a televised tell-all starring in the Peacock docuseries Casey Anthony, Where the Truth Lies. In this three-part special, she made bombshell accusations, including blaming her father, George Anthony, for Kayle's death. The only person in this world that matters to me still is my daughter, but I'm still defending the fact that I didn't hurt her. The new documentary is also generating headlines like this. Casey Anthony blames her father for daughter Kayle's death. When contacted today by Inside Edition, George said, "I am in contact with an attorney. That's all I can say at this moment." He was tight-lipped when photographers approached him today. "Do you have any comment about your daughter's allegations? George, have you got anything to say?" While Casey painted herself as a victim of her father's abuse, George and Cindy Anthony weren't staying silent. In January 2024, they appeared on an ONI true crime reality show where they took lie detector tests while recounting Kay's tragic disappearance. In one clip, George denied knowing where Kay was during the 6 months she was missing. In another, Cindy made a shocking admission, saying she believes Casey 100% knows what happened. Then, as if the Casey Anthony saga wasn't over, she resurfaced yet again in 2025. This time on TikTok. In March, she posted her first video to promote her new Substack page, claiming to be a legal advocate and researcher. In the 3-minute clip, Casey attempted to reintroduce herself to the public. "I feel that it's necessary if I'm going to continue to operate appropriately as a legal advocate that I start to advocate for myself and also advocate for my daughter." And just like that, Casey Anthony was back in the public eye. Not as a grieving mother. Not as a woman seeking justice, but as someone reinventing herself once again. From lies to trials to documentaries to social media influencer, the Casey Anthony story never truly ended. It just keeps evolving. But no matter how many times she tries to rewrite her own narrative, one thing remains unchanged. A child is gone and no one has been held accountable. The public still cries out for justice. The rage never truly faded. And the ghost of Kay Anthony still lingers over this entire case. Even the jurors who reached the not guilty verdict weren't safe from the wrath of the people. They received so many death threats that their identities were kept hidden. Story 2. In a wealthy neighborhood in Bombay, British India lived a middle-class Parsi family with French origin. Back in 1899, the Ruxton family produced a brilliant, smart boy named Buck Ruxton. Despite his high intelligence, he was less social than normal kids his age. And then he grew up to be a man who made his family proud. Dr. Ruxton, as they called him, was a well-known specialist in medicine, midwifery, and gynecology. A man of skill, of reputation, of trust, and then a man who murdered his wife. And there were eyewitnesses. In a remote Scottish ravine, a gruesome discovery sent shock waves through the community. Scattered remains carefully concealed, bore the marks of an unsettling precision. Finding evidence of a mind both calculating and merciless. Authorities were left with more questions than answers. The faces were unrecognizable, fingerprints erased, and body parts scattered like a grotesque puzzle, waiting to be solved. Who are the victims? Who is responsible for such a heinous act? And perhaps most disturbingly, what kind of person could do this? Each severed limb, each blood-stained clue, brought them closer to a chilling revelation, one that would shake the foundations of forensics. This was no ordinary crime. As investigators pieced together the fragments of a horrifying truth, they realized they were unraveling one of the most gruesome cases the world had ever seen. The deeper they dug, the more unsettling the reality became. What they uncovered would shock a nation and leave an unforgettable mark on the world of forensic science. This is the story of Buck Ruxton, the smart boy who would change the course of criminal investigation with a crime so heinous that it exposed the depths of human brutality. But before he became a cold-blooded murderer, Buck Ruxton was an ordinary son to a respectable family. Buck Ruxton was born in Bombay, British India, now called Mumbai, on March 21, 1899 into a wealthy middle-class family. His upbringing was respectable and, though he was a sensitive boy with few friends, he was highly intelligent. Early on, he set his sights on becoming a doctor. With his parents' financial support, he studied at the University of Bombay, earning his Bachelor of Medicine in 1922 and his Bachelor of Surgery in 1923. Shortly after, he secured a position at a Bombay hospital specializing in medicine, midwifery, and gynecology. His ambitions did not stop there. On October 29, 1923, Ruxton was commissioned into the Indian Medical Service as a medical officer. He was sent to Basra, the city of great strategic importance under British control, where soldiers and civilians alike suffered from war wounds, infections, and the scorching heat of West Asia. The medical stations in Basra were overcrowded, and young doctors like Ruxton were expected to burn the midnight oil, treating cases of battle injuries, disease, and malnutrition. It was intense labor that he endured, making him a strong practitioner, but a human being lacking in empathy each passing day. Later, Ruxton was stationed in Baghdad, where he witnessed the brutal aftermath of war firsthand. Battlefield medicine was gruesome, and doctors were often forced to make split-second decisions that meant life or death. The constant exposure to suffering and death shaped him in ways that would become evident in the years to come. In October 1926, he gave up his commission, turning his back on military medicine and setting his sights on other opportunities. During this time, Ruxton entered into an arranged marriage with a Parsi woman named Mabai Janiri Gadil Ali in May 1925. However, the marriage did not work out. With financial assistance from his family and the Bombay Medical Service, Ruxton relocated to Britain in 1926. He attended medical courses at London's University College Hospital under the name Gabriel Haykame before moving to Edinburgh in 1927 to begin studies towards obtaining a fellowship of the Royal Colleges of Surgeons. Although he failed his entrance examination, the General Medical Council authorized him to practice medicine in the United Kingdom based on his Bombay qualifications. Shortly thereafter, he legally changed his name via deed poll to Buck Ruxton. While studying in Edinburgh, Ruxton met a 26-year-old woman named Isabella Vanas, who managed a cafe in the city. Isabella had been briefly married to a Dutchman in 1919. But the marriage had lasted for only weeks, and she had resumed using her maiden name, Kerr. The two slowly began liking each other and were soon a couple. Isabella accompanied Ruxton when he relocated to England in 1928. There, he worked as a locum for a London doctor, Manik Motif, a fellow Parsi, before becoming an assistant to a Stephanie-based doctor, Bri. While the relocation was happening, Isabella was already pregnant with Ruxton's child. In 1929, Isabella gave birth to the couple's first child, a daughter they named Elizabeth. The family seemed stable, but behind the facade, Ruxton's aggressive nature and controlling behavior were becoming more evident. His jealousy and paranoia were slowly growing, and it was not long before he unleashed the monster within. Now the fits of anger and bouts of hysteria became routine in this house, where a home that Isabella made with love had turned into a hellhole for her. Their fights were so intense that police were called to their house multiple times, only for Isabella to return to him after his desperate pleas and apologies. Isabella tried to escape. On several occasions, she packed her things and left for Edinburgh with her children. But Ruxton always managed to pull her back in, begging her to return, swearing his love, promising change while bending on his knees, his head down, and tears rolling down his eyes. But nothing changed. In 1932, Isabella attempted to unalive herself. The method she used was gruesome. Gas asphyxiation was nearly fatal. She lost a pregnancy in the process. But even this did not end their relationship. She stayed trapped in a cycle of violence and manipulation by a man who knew a way with his words. The police were familiar with the Ruxton household, having been called multiple times to settle their heated arguments. During one visit, Ruxton told an officer, "Sergeant, I feel like murdering two persons. My wife is going out to meet a man." In early September 1935, Isabella traveled to Edinburgh to visit her sister. She was accompanied by a prominent Lancaster family, the Edmondsons, who were close to the Ruxtons. Buck Ruxton did not go, staying behind due to his busy schedule as a doctor. But in his mind, this trip confirmed his worst suspicions. He was certain that Isabella was having an affair. He was even sure of the man she was having an affair with, Robert Edmondson, a young assistant editor in the local town hall. His jealousy consumed him, and by the time Isabella returned, Ruxton had already decided her fate. On the night of September 14, 1935, Isabella left to visit her sisters in Blackpool and see the Blackpool illuminations. She returned home late around midnight. That night, Ruxton's paranoia and rage had taken the best of him. Confronting Isabella with allegations of infidelity that night, Ruxton lost control of himself. The sick assumption of his wife being a cheater left him in a fit of rage. Not knowing how to handle the monster that Ruxton had become, Isabella panicked, trying to run away. But it was too late. Blinded by fury, Ruxton attacked his wife. Perhaps it began with his hands closing around her throat, cutting off her breath, squeezing until her struggles weakened and her body slumped. Did she lose consciousness, or did she die in that cruel, suffocating embrace? We may never know. But strangulation was not enough. His rage demanded more. He beat her, fists colliding with her delicate bones, shattering the bone structure of her face. And then came the blade, a cold, fatal finality, driving into her flesh, spilling her life onto the floor. He strangled, beat, and stabbed Isabella to death. But someone else had seen too much. Remember the eyewitness? She was murdered by the monster for the intention of eliminating every trace of his crime. Mary Jane Roger, their housemaid. Perhaps she heard the struggle and rushed in. Perhaps she was already there, her presence an unfortunate twist of fate. Perhaps she screamed. Perhaps she tried to run, but Ruxton could not let her live. Did she plead? Did she beg for her life? It didn't matter. His frenzied wrath turned to her with equal savagery. Blows rained down, the housemaid's skull fracturing beneath his fists. Maybe she cried out once. Maybe she had time to realize the horror of her fate before his hands found her throat. A desperate struggle. A body thrashing, fingers clawing at his skin, weakly grasping at nothing. Her final breath choked into silence and then the knife again. Did he stab her to ensure she was dead? Or had he simply lost all control? His insatiable violence continuing long after her life had drained away. When it was over, when both women lay lifeless, their blood staining the floor, Ruxton stood amidst the carnage he had created. But his madness was not yet complete. Ruxton quickly set to work covering his tracks. Before the murders, he had told both of his charwomen not to come to the house until Monday, already ensuring no one would enter the home too soon and see the monstrosity he had committed that night. He had already killed Isabella and Mary Jane, but their suffering had not yet ended. The family, who once saw the intelligent boy making his mark in the most respectable field in India, would later be informed about the heinous ways their son used his knowledge. Ruxton used his medical expertise to dismember the bodies. Blood pooled in the house, staining the stairs and walls. He removed the carpet and burned towels in the garden to destroy evidence. The next day, he dropped his children off at a friend's home before returning to clean the crime scene. Later, he asked a patient and her husband to help him prepare for decorators, an excuse to explain the missing carpets and the mess in his home. When Mrs. Hampshire arrived at Dalton Square, she saw something was terribly wrong. Blood-stained carpet, a locked room with straw protruding from beneath the door, and a suit, Ruxton's suit, soaked in blood. He gave them stained stair carpeting and his suit, asking them to clean it. He thought he had covered his tracks until a complete stranger discovers the horrors of his unfathomable crime. The morning of September 29, 1935 began like any other for Susan Haynes Johnson. A young woman walking near an old stone bridge nestled in the remote countryside 2 miles or 3 kilometers north of Moffat. A quiet market town in Dumfries, Scotland. The landscape was serene, the garden home Lynn stream flowing with grace beneath the bridge, its waters heavy from recent rains. Mist lingered over the hills, and the air was damp with the scent of earth and foliage. As she leaned over the parapet of the bridge to admire the view, soaking the misty air in, something caught her eye. A large misshapen bundle crammed against a boulder in the rushing water below. At first, she thought it might be an abandoned sack of clothing or discarded rubbish that swept down the stream. But something about the way it was caught on the rocks made her stomach churn. It did not feel right, and every fiber in her body was telling her to run away. But ignoring the cues of her body, Susan walked closer to the sack. The fabric, darkened by water, clung tightly to its contents, revealing unsettling contours of a human body. Then, a grotesque detail sent a jolt of horror through her body. A human arm, bloated and partially decomposed, protruded from the fabric. Fingers curling unnaturally, as if reaching for something that Susan could not see. Susan gasped, stumbling back from the parapet, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. She could not tear her gaze away from the limp, lifeless limb, the exposed flesh gray and rotting, slashed with nauseating precision. A chill crawled up her spine. Someone had mutilated this body in the most disrespectful way possible. Her scream teared through the morning stillness. What started as a pleasant morning turned into an unforgettable one. A day that will haunt Susan forever in her dreams. The gruesome discoveries at Garden Home Lynn sent shockwaves through Scotland. The Dumfries Constabulary, faced with a crime of unprecedented brutality, knew they needed specialized expertise. Detective officers from Glasgow were immediately summoned. And by the following day, Detective Lieutenant William Ewing and Detective Lieutenant Bertie Hammond arrived in Moffat. What they found was nothing short of a nightmare. The bodies were mangled, severed, and stripped of nearly every identifying feature, which presented an immediate challenge. Even determining their sex was difficult due to the extensive disfigurement. The killer had left nothing to chance, making sure that traditional methods of identification such as dental records or fingerprints were either impossible or severely compromised. But killers always make mistakes. While reviewing the case in Dumfries, Detective Ewing happened upon a newspaper report detailing the recent disappearance of two women from Lancaster, England. Something about the description stopped him cold. One of the missing women bore a remarkable similarity, at least in height and build, to one of the butchered victims found in the Annan River. Ewing's instincts told him there was a connection, so he decided to follow his instincts, and soon the evidence began mounting. Amid the bloody ruins of the corpses, a single piece of newspaper would prove to be one of the most disturbing clues. The victims had been wrapped in editions of the Sunday Graphic, a national publication. On the surface, this meant little until detectives discovered something crucial. This specific edition of the Sunday Graphic had only been distributed in the Lancaster district. The trail of horror was beginning to lead away from Moffat and into England. Another glaring detail sent chills down the spine of the investigators. The manner in which the bodies had been dismembered was unlike any ordinary murder. This was no haphazard act of rage. Instead, the precise incisions, the calculated removal of identifying features, and the total destruction of distinguishing marks all pointed to one irrefutable fact. The murderer had an expert knowledge of human anatomy. This was not the work of a mere criminal. This was the work of a highly skilled surgeon. As detectives dug deeper into the Lancaster disappearances, two names surfaced. Number one was Mrs. Isabella Ruxton, the wife of a prominent physician, Dr. for Buck Ruxton, and the second was Mary Roger, Isabella's maid, who had vanished alongside her employer. The connection was too strong to ignore. Ruxton's wife and maid had disappeared, and two mutilated bodies had been found hundreds of miles away. Detectives turned their attention toward Dr. Buck Ruxton, a man known famously for his precision. Rumors had already swirled about his volatile temper and his obsessive jealousy toward his wife. Now with 2 unclaimed bodies and his wife missing, the police had good reason to suspect him. It was time to pay him a visit. Dr. Buck Ruxton was soon arrested, and with his detention, the police were given unrestricted access to his house in Dalton Square, Lancaster. What they found inside confirmed their worst fears. The bathroom, once a place of cleanliness and somewhat luxury, bore the unmistakable scars of murder. Blood stains, some still visible. Others, desperately scrubbed away, covered the stair carpet and the floors. The scene rire of a failed cover-up. The murderer's attempt to wash away his sins, proving futile under the scrutiny of forensic science. But a body is more than just flesh and blood. It touches things. It leaves marks. And it was fingerprints that would finally seal Ruxton's fate. The forensic team knew that if they could match a fingerprint from the bodies to any print inside the house, it would prove beyond doubt that at least one of the victims had once lived there. But there was a problem. Only one set of fingertips remained intact, those belonging to the maid, Mary Roger. The other set, belonging to Isabella Ruxton, had been severed and were never recovered. The killer had made sure that his wife's hands would never betray him, even if she had betrayed him in his sick mind. But he had underestimated the tenacity of science. Detective Bertie Hammond and Detective Sergeant Duncan meticulously combed through the house, examining every possible surface. From the lampshades in the attic to medicine bottles in the basement, nothing was left untouched. Every cup, saucer, bottle, and dish was dusted, and hundreds of fingerprints emerged. Then in the bathroom, they found the one that mattered most, a clear palm print on the door. This print would later be forensically matched to the dead hands of Mary Roger. She had been here. She had died here, and so had Isabella Ruxton. The final nail in Buck Ruxton's coffin came from Professor John Glaster, the forensic scientist leading the post-mortem examination. With Ruxton's wife horrifically disfigured, traditional identification was nearly impossible. But Glaster had another trick up his sleeve. Using X-ray imaging, he superimposed radiographs of Isabella Ruxton's skull over old photographs of her taken when she was alive and well. The shape of the skull, the jawline, and the bone structure all aligned perfectly. There was no longer any doubt. The butchered remains pulled from the river were those of Isabella Ruxton and Mary Roger, and their murderer was Dr. Buck Ruxton. The case of Dr. Ruxton would go on to become one of the most groundbreaking murder investigations in British history. It was a case of science versus savagery where forensic innovation won over the butchery of a distasteful man. Dr. Buck Ruxton had believed himself untouchable. A man so meticulous in dismembering his victims that he thought no one could ever piece them back together. But he was wrong. The river had not carried away his sins. The newspapers had not hidden his crime, and the fingerprints of the dead had spoken louder than any defense he could muster. A doctor who once saved lives was now condemned to die. On March 2, 1936, the trial of Dr. Buck Ruxton commenced at Manchester's High Court of Justice. He was charged with the murders of his wife, Isabella Ruxton, and their housemaid, Mary Jane Roger. The case had drawn widespread attention due to the gruesome nature of the crimes and the forensic techniques used to identify the victims. Ruxton pleaded not guilty. But the prosecution built a strong case against him, supported by forensic evidence and witness testimonies. The prosecution, led by Joseph Cookie Jackson KC, argued that Ruxton's motive was rooted in jealousy. Following the murders, Ruxton attempted to conceal his crimes by meticulously dismembering the bodies. The remains were then transported over 100 miles from Lancaster to Scotland, where they were disposed of in a remote ravine near the River Lynn. He took extensive measures to prevent identification, including mutilating facial features and removing fingertips. Ruxton's defense, led by Norman Butt Casey, attempted to cast doubt on the identification of the bodies and suggested alternative explanations for the presence of blood stains in his home. The defense argued that the forensic evidence was circumstantial and did not definitively link Ruxton to the crime. However, forensic experts had successfully linked the fabric used to wrap the bodies to materials found in Ruxton's home, and the blood patterns matched those of the victims. Additionally, Ruxton's erratic behavior following the discovery of the remains, including providing conflicting accounts of his wife's whereabouts, further undermined his defense. After a trial that lasted 11 days, the jury deliberated for just over an hour before returning a guilty verdict. Dr. Buck Ruxton was found guilty of double murder, and on May 12, 1936, he was set to be hanged at Home Prison, Manchester. A final twist emerged after Ruxton's execution when a sealed letter he had written shortly after his arrest was made public. The letter wrote, "I killed Mrs. Ruxton in a fit of temper because I thought she had been with a man. I was mad at the time. Mary Jane Roger was present at the time. I had to kill her." This confession removed any lingering doubts about his sentence. It was confirmed that he had indeed not only murdered those people, but had their bodies dismembered. However, why he decided to commit such horrors to a human body remains a mystery to this day. Story 3. She fell out the window upstairs on the second floor. Okay. Are you there with her? She's laying on the ground, black neck. Are you with her right now? I'm right here right now. She's laying on the ground, black neck. The woman found here was just one of many who either went missing or suffered abuse at the hands of the man who lived in this house. After 2 years, the decomposing remains of these 11 women were found inside, making neighbors realized that the awful smell lingering in the air wasn't from a sausage factory, but from this very house, and it became known as the True House of Horrors. This case was so disturbing that even after his acquit, many still believe the so-called Cleveland Strangler had more than 11 victims. That's because several other murders in this town remain unsolved to this day, and all the victims were women. I know one thing that I think always made me mad is they had kids and they was out on the street. Yeah, that's the big thing in my head. So today we remember them. Because no troubled past can ever justify what they went through. And once you hear the full story, you'll understand exactly why. I don't know. I think I just choked her. Not in life. Yet. His name was Anthony Soule, the man you saw casually describing how he killed his victims in that video. And like many serial killers before him, he had a troubled past, a past that shaped his twisted view of women, seeing them as nothing more than objects he could torture, harass, and kill. Anthony was one of 7 children. Born to Claudia Garrison, a single mother struggling to raise them all. But tragedy struck when one of Claudia's daughters, Anani's sister, passed away, leaving behind 7 children of her own. With nowhere else to go, they moved in with Claudia, bringing the total number of kids in the household to 14. Now, you might have heard the old rhyme about the lady who lived in a shoe and had so many kids, she didn't know what to do. But this was no nursery tale. According to Anani's niece, Leona, who was one of the 7 children forced to move in, their time in that house was pure misery. Claudia subjected them to brutal beatings and relentless abuse while her own 7 children watched from the sidelines. In one of the most horrifying moments of her childhood, Leona recalled how Claudia, the very woman who was supposed to protect and care for her, forced her to strip naked and then brutally beat her. In a later interview, Leona recalls this horrifying experience, saying, "But the nightmare didn't stop there. Claudia's own children were reportedly spared from the worst of her wrath. But for Leona and the other girls in the house, the abuse was relentless." Now, according to Leona, one of Claudia's older sons also took part in the cruelty, routinely beating and assaulting the young girls. Tragically, it didn't stop at just one person. It's said that other male relatives living in the house joined in, creating a cycle of unspeakable violence and trauma. Leona also revealed that Anani's soul was often silent during these horrific acts. He never intervened. Instead, he would sit back and watch as the abuse happened right in front of him. But what Leona didn't realize was that for Anthony, witnessing mistreatment had become almost normal. Growing up in a home where abuse was a daily occurrence, he began imitating the cruelty he saw. Shockingly, at just 11 years old, he started molesting his own 10-year-old niece, Leona's sister, subjecting her to the same suffering he had witnessed, continuing the cycle of pain that had been ingrained in their home. Fast forward to January 24, 1978. Anthony joined the United States Marine Corps. Surprisingly, he excelled in the military. Over the next 7 years, he built an impressive record, earning multiple Good Conduct medals, certificates, ribbons, and letters of appreciation. By all accounts, his military career was defined by discipline, hard work, and achievements. And upon his honorable discharge in 1985, Anthony returned home to Cleveland. For a while, he managed to live a relatively normal life. But that facade crumbled 4 years later in 1989, when he committed his first known violent crime. It all started with Melvette Stockwell, a 3-month pregnant woman and an worker who believed she was simply meeting a new client. On that fateful night, she accompanied Anthony to his home, expecting a routine exchange, do the job, get paid, and leave. But this wasn't like her other clients. As soon as they stepped inside, the charm disappeared. Anani's entire demeanor shifted. He suddenly became aggressive, grabbing her before she could react. He tied her hands and feet with zip ties and a belt, gagging her with a rag to keep her from screaming. She was completely at his mercy. But then he stopped. Instead of attacking her right away, he told her he was going to feed her before he killed her. Imagine hearing that. You think you're about to meet your end, but instead your captor is talking about feeding you first, like you're on some twisted death row. The horror of that moment must have been unimaginable. But then, Out of nowhere, Anthony decided to take a nap before going through with his plan. That was her only chance. In a moment of sheer desperation, she managed to break free, escape through a window, and signal for help from the rooftop. A neighbor spotted her and called the police. And when officers arrived, they found her shaking and terrified. But miraculously, she had survived. Anthony was arrested and charged with rape, and kidnapping. In 1989, 3 women from the same street as Anthony had already been murdered. As it turned out, Anthony was already on the authorities' radar. But despite the charges against him, he pleaded guilty to rape and was sentenced to only 5 to 15 years in prison. While behind bars, Anthony underwent multiple psychological evaluations. Yet, he continuously insisted he would never commit such acts again. Despite his disturbing past, Anthony managed to convince the system that he had reformed. What's even more chilling is that he was not classified as a sex offender, meaning that when he was released in 2005, he was free to roam the streets of Cleveland, Ohio, just like any other citizen. That same year, he moved into 122205 Imperial Avenue, a house that would soon become infamous. However, 2 years later, Anthony lost his job at a local factory. Under mysterious circumstances, unemployed, he began collecting benefits and making money on the side by working as a scrap metal collector. But as his financial situation deteriorated, so did his mental state. He became more withdrawn, spending most of his time in his house, avoiding neighbors, and becoming more erratic in his behavior. Those who lived nearby noticed a change in him as he looked unkempt, distant, and was no longer the same person they had once known. Then came the turning point. Anthony began a relationship with a woman named Lori, a niece of the governor in Cleveland, and they quickly spiraled into a toxic cycle of heavy drug use, particularly crack. But while Anthony was sinking deeper into addiction, Lori wanted out. And so in 2007, when Anthony was fired from his job at the factory, Lori saw it as her chance to break free. She left him determined to leave that world behind. Anthony, however, was far from ready to let go. The heartbreak shattered something inside him, sending him into a dark spiral. He stayed behind on Imperial Avenue, but from that moment on, his reclusive tendencies became even more pronounced. He withdrew into himself, his behavior becoming more unstable. And then the horrors began. That same year, a 10-year-old girl living nearby vanished without a trace. Just months later, another woman, a 33-year-old nursing assistant named Tashina Culver, disappeared. Tashina had struggled with drug addiction, but she was also a dedicated healthcare worker trying her best to turn her life around. No one reported her missing. No police alerts, no flyers, just another woman gone. 2 months later, 25-year-old Landanda Long, a mother of 3, also vanished. Then in October of 2008, 45-year-old Michelle Mason, who had 2 sons and was a devoted volunteer for the local AIDS task force, was also reported missing. Her mother, terrified, went to the police in early December. She begged them to look into her daughter's disappearance, but nothing happened. The case remained open and no one connected the dots. Meanwhile, over on Imperial Avenue, a gut-wrenching stench was growing worse by the day. The entire neighborhood complained. A smell so rancid it made people gag just walking past. And the most disturbing part, Anthony Soule himself of it. Whenever someone wrinkled their nose and questioned the putrid odor clinging to him, Soule had a ready excuse. "It's that damn sausage factory next door," he'd say with a shrug. And somehow people believed him. After all, Ray's Sausage had been in business for over 5 decades. And well, it was a meat factory. Maybe it really did stink. But the complaints kept piling up. Eventually, City Hall got involved, sending inspectors to investigate. The pressure was on, and Ray Sausage was forced to take drastic action, spending over $30,000 on deep cleaning, new ventilation systems, and odor eliminating technology. And yet, the smell didn't go away. It clung to the air, thick and putrid. By this time, Soule was unraveling. In early December of 2008, a terrified woman ran straight to a police car parked in the neighborhood, bleeding, shaking, and screaming. She claimed Soule had attacked her, dragged her inside his house, choked her, and attempted to assault her. When police stormed Soule's foul-smelling home and arrested him, he had his own version of the story, insisting that she was the criminal, that she had tried to rob him. Both bore scratches and bruises, making it difficult for officers to determine who was telling the truth. With no clear evidence, both were arrested, but later released due to insufficient proof. Just a month later, in January of 2009, Kim Smith, a 44-year-old woman who had been caring for her elderly father, disappeared. That year alone, 5 more women, Nancy Cobbs, Imelda Hunter, Janice Webb, Telly Sieferson, and Diane Turner, vanished without a trace. The alarming number of missing women in such a small area didn't go unnoticed by the community. Residents began organizing searches, handing out flyers, and trying to bring attention to the disappearances. Shockingly, Anthony himself joined these efforts, blending in with those who were desperately searching for the very women he had taken. Then came October of 2009. A woman named Sean Morris visited Anani's house, seemingly unfazed by the overpowering stench that clung to the air. The two spent the evening drinking, using drugs, and talking. Nothing intimate, just casual conversation. The next morning, as she prepared to leave, she realized she had left her ID upstairs. As she walked up to retrieve it, she suddenly heard a chilling click sound from behind her. Before she could react, Anthony lunged at her, attacking her without warning. He overpowered her, assaulted just like so many before her, and then went through the house, locking all the doors and windows. It became clear that he had no intention of letting her go. But Sean saw a fleeting moment of opportunity, one she knew she had to take. Summoning all her strength, she threw herself out of a third-story window, crashing 30 feet to the ground below. Anthony, realizing what had happened, bolted downstairs, completely unclothed, desperate to drag her back inside. But this time, fate wasn't on his side. 2 passers-by witnessed the horrifying scene and immediately called 911. The call you already heard back in the intro. Because of them, Sean was rushed to the hospital with severe injuries, including multiple broken bones. Despite the brutal attack, she chose not to speak to the police about what had happened. However, someone else would. Just a week later, on October 27th, a woman named Let Billups came forward to share her own horrifying experience with Anthony Sowell. She had been through a terrifying ordeal back in September, one that followed the same pattern as before. She had gone to his house for a drink only for him to suddenly turn violent. Unlike so many others, she was lucky enough to survive. However, the trauma had kept her silent until now. Finally, in late October, her testimony was enough for authorities to issue both an arrest warrant and a search warrant for Anthony Sowell. On October 29, SWAT officers stormed his house, expecting to take Anthony into custody. But what they found was far worse than they could have imagined. Anthony wasn't home, but the stench was overwhelming. Dead flies covered every surface. Then came the grisly discoveries, decomposing bodies, one after another, some of which had been rotting away for years. The house of horrors that had plagued the neighborhood for so long was finally exposed, and a manhunt was immediately launched. For 2 days, police scoured the city for Anthony Sowell. Then, on October 31st, as he casually strolled down the street, officers spotted him. They pulled over and cuffed him on the spot. He looked disheveled with dirt and twigs clinging to his clothes as if he had been sleeping outside, hiding in the bushes for days. But there was no hiding from what had been found in his home. What happened in this house behind me is simply a nightmare. And there are a lot of deeply disturbing questions for authorities here. There were 6 bodies found in this house last week. This morning, we know there are more. We discovered 4 additional what we believe to be 4 bodies. It appears that this man had a sustainable appetite that he had to fill. To shed light on Anthony's victims, let's get to know them before their lives were consumed by addiction. Because they all had stories, dreams, and struggles. They had every reason to keep going, and there was no reason for them to be murdered. Crystal Dewar, a mother of 7, was 35 years old when she vanished in May 2007. Her son, a U.S. Marine, desperately searched for her, but she wouldn't be found until police unearthed her remains in Anthony's backyard 2 years later. Loved ones recalled that Crystal had turned to drugs after losing one of her children, a pain that consumed her. Despite her struggles, she was a devoted mother who, in another life, could have had a different ending. Tisana Culver was 33 years old, a trained nursing assistant and cosmetologist who had once envisioned a future helping others. However, tragedy struck when her boyfriend took his own life, sending her into a spiral of grief and addiction. At one point, she lived only 4 houses away from Anthony, unaware of the fate that awaited her. She disappeared in June 2008, leaving behind loved ones who never stopped wondering what had happened to her. Leisiand Long, just 25 years old, was the youngest of Anthony's victims. A mother of 3, she disappeared 3 months after Tisana. No one even filed a missing persons report for her, a heartbreaking reflection of how addiction often isolates its victims from the support they need. Her remains were never fully recovered. Only her skull was found in Anthony's basement. On the other hand, Michelle Mason had fought hard to turn her life around. At 45, she was living with HIV and had battled heroin addiction, but she refused to let her struggles define her. After surviving a shooting, she dedicated her life to helping others, working with an AIDS outreach program, and focusing on her children. She disappeared on or around October 4, 2008. Another life full of resilience and hope cut tragically short. Tanya Carmichael was a mother, a fighter, and tragically the first victim to be identified from Anthony Soule's House of Horrors. Though she struggled with substance abuse, her loved ones never stopped caring. When she vanished in December 2008, they knew something was wrong. Tanya's mother wasted no time. She reported her missing within a week, desperate for answers. But the police saw just another black woman with a drug problem and failed to take the case seriously. Even when her abandoned car was found near Soule's neighborhood, they ignored the red flag. Years later, forensic testimony would expose the brutality of her death. Strangled with a telephone charger, discarded as if she didn't matter. But Tanya did matter. She was loved. She was missed. And her family never stopped fighting to make sure she wouldn't be forgotten. Kemet Smith, 44, was a caretaker in every sense of the word. She dedicated her life to looking after her ailing father, balancing the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. In January 2009, she disappeared without a trace, leaving her father behind, and breaking the hearts of those who knew her. Alda Amy Hunter, 47, had a life marked by hardships and resilience. Raised in Chicago, she was an avid reader, a girl with dreams before her life took an unexpected turn. At just 14, she became pregnant by one of her teachers and gave birth to a child with cerebral palsy who was also deaf. This unimaginable responsibility weighed on her young shoulders, and eventually addiction found its way into her life. Yet, she was more than her struggles. She was a mother, a woman who had once been full of promise. Nancy Cobbs was a 44-year-old grandmother, deeply loved and fiercely missed. When she disappeared in April 2009, her family refused to sit idly by. They kicked in the doors of abandoned houses, desperately searching for her. Tragically, her body was only discovered months later, wrapped in 6 plastic bags. Forensic testimony later revealed that she had been strangled with a shoelace. Another victim of Anani's cruelty, Tella Jefferson, 31, had a difficult upbringing, bouncing from foster home to foster home. She frequently ran away, searching for something better, but addiction tightened its grip on her. Like Tashina and Amy, no one even realized she was missing until the bodies began surfacing. Janice Webb, 48, was last seen on June 3, 2009 at her boyfriend's home in Lakewood, Ohio, just outside Cleveland. A woman with her own battles, she never imagined that crossing paths with Anthony would be her final chapter. Diane Turner, 38, had endured the unthinkable, losing all 6 of her children to the state. The pain of separation pushed her deeper into addiction, but she was still a mother who had once held hope for her family. She was the last of Anani's victims to disappear in September 2009, the same month that Let Billups, 37, survived his brutal attack. These women were not just victims. They were women who had lived, loved, and endured unimaginable struggles. Their stories deserve to be told, not just as part of Anani's crimes, but as a reminder of the lives that were stolen and the justice they finally received. What's particularly gut-wrenching is that by the time authorities finally captured Anani's soul, he was 50 years old, meaning he had already spent decades living freely, committing these crimes unnoticed. His arrest on October 29, 2009 was just the beginning of a long, drawn-out legal battle. Soul's trial was initially scheduled for June 2, 2010, but what followed was a series of postponements. His defense team argued that they needed more time to prepare, review thousands of pages of evidence, and analyze hours of surveillance footage taken from a neighboring property. The trial was pushed to September 7, then to February 14, then to May 2, and finally to June 6, 2011. When proceedings finally began, Soul faced 85 charges, including 11 counts of aggravated murder and 74 counts of rape, kidnapping, abuse of a corpse, and tampering with evidence. His initial plea was not guilty by reason of insanity, but he later changed it to simply not guilty. Despite his attempts to evade responsibility, the evidence against him was overwhelming. Survivors testified. Forensic experts detailed the gruesome conditions of his home, and jurors were confronted with horrifying photos of the crime scene. On July 22, 2011, after weeks of testimony, the jury found him guilty on all but 2 counts. The decision was clear. Anthony Soul was a serial killer who had preyed on the most vulnerable women in his community. I will now read the jury's verdicts. I'll ask the defendant to please rise. With respect to the matter of State of Ohio versus Anthony Soul, criminal case number 530,885. Sentencing proceedings as to count 1. Tanya Carmichael. We the jury being duly impaneled and sworn do hereby find that the aggravating circumstances which the defendant was found guilty of committing do outweigh the mitigating factors presented in this case by proof beyond a reasonable doubt. We therefore unanimously find that the sentence of death should be imposed upon the defendant, Anthony Soul. All 12 jurors have signed their name to this verdict form and have not completed the additional form with respect to life without parole as directed by the court. Moving on then to count 7, sentencing proceedings relating to Nancy Cobbs. When it came time for sentencing, the prosecution argued that Soul showed no remorse for his crimes. The jurors agreed. On August 10, they recommended the death penalty, and 2 days later, Judge Dick Ambrose upheld their decision. Soul was officially sentenced to death on September 14, 2011. He was transferred to death row at Chillicothe Correctional Institution, a stark contrast to the freedom he had once used to terrorize his victims. So and his attorneys spent years filing appeal after appeal, arguing that excessive media coverage, a closed courtroom, and poor legal representation had denied him a fair trial. The Ohio Supreme Court rejected his appeal in December 2016. And when he took the case to the United States Supreme Court in 2017, they declined to hear it. By May 2020, Soul had exhausted all legal options. Then, before the state could carry out his execution, fate stepped in. On February 8, 2021 at age 61, Soul died in a prison hospital from an unspecified terminal illness. Some speculated liver failure or cancer, but no official cause was released. He may be gone, but the nightmare he created still lingers, a haunting reminder of how he not only took lives, but lived among the dead, sleeping beside his victims' corpses. The trauma he inflicted didn't just disappear with his death. It still weighs heavy on the community. In fact, in 2021, 5 of Seoul's surviving victims bravely shared their stories and snapped notorious, exposing the horrors they endured and the failures that let it happen. And here's the harsh reality. Back then, when black women went missing, law enforcement barely lifted a finger. And let's be real, this isn't an isolated case. We've covered multiple cases just like this, including another infamous strangler from Charlotte who also murdered 11 black women. The red flags were everywhere, but officers failed to connect the dots. Was it carelessness or did they just not care? Eventually, the city of Cleveland had to answer for its failures, paying out $1.3 million in settlements to the families of Seoul's victims. Story 4. They were literally slaughtered. And I think who could do that to little children? It was so intentional. They slaughtered them. They say no crime is more unforgivable than taking a child's life. And in this case, that horror became the driving force behind a decades-long investigation in Phoenix, Arizona. On Labor Day 1982, a father lost his daughter to an epileptic seizure, a tragedy no parent should ever face. But when he returned home hoping to grieve in peace, he walked into something far worse. His wife and her 2 children had been brutally murdered. One loss was already unbearable. But this was a nightmare beyond imagination. Detectives scrambled for answers, chasing leads that led nowhere, desperately searching for a motive. But as the years passed, the case went cold. Now more than 42 years later, 2 chilling questions remain. Who slaughtered Valerie and her little girls? And why? When people hear about an unsolved murder from more than 40 years ago, it's easy to assume the case is lost to time. But time doesn't erase the pain, and it certainly doesn't erase the truth. With today's advancements in forensic technology and the power of public attention, we've seen cold cases cracked wide open, revealing shocking answers after decades of silence. The brutal stabbing of a young mother and her 2 little girls is one of those cases. A tragedy that still lingers in the shadows, waiting for justice. Someone out there knows what happened that night. And after all these years, the Pride family still deserves answers. But before Valerie's name was tied to one of Phoenix's most haunting murder cases, she was a young woman with big dreams and an unstoppable drive. Born on March 9, 1958, she grew up in Arizona. With 5 brothers and 1 sister, shaping her into a strong and determined person. She attended South Mountain High School where she was known for her intelligence and ambition. After graduating, she set her sights on Arizona State University, determined to build a better future for herself. But Valerie wasn't just a student. She was also in love. In high school, she started dating a young man named Jimmy Pride. Their relationship blossomed and in 1974, they got married. Just 1 year later, they welcomed their first daughter, Shantia. Then in 1977, their family grew again when Valerie gave birth to their second daughter, Dwana. Even as a young mother, Valerie refused to let go of her ambitions. She had dreams of becoming an electrician, an industry dominated by men at the time, and she wasn't about to let anything stand in her way. Around the time Dwana was born, she landed an apprenticeship co-sponsored by the Electrical Workers Union, a rare and competitive opportunity. But Valerie didn't just enter the field. She made history. She became the first black female electrician to work at the Palo Verde nuclear plant, breaking barriers while raising two small children. As you can see, her life was a balancing act, juggling motherhood, work, and the pressures of being a pioneer in her field. But despite her accomplishments, Valerie's personal life wasn't without struggles. She and Jimmy's marriage eventually came to an end, leading to a divorce. Still, she remained focused on her career and her children, determined to provide them with the best life possible. After her divorce, Valerie found love again with a man named Ben Daniels, a co-worker at the nuclear plant. He also had children from a previous relationship, and as their bond deepened, they began planning a future together. But beneath the surface, their relationship wasn't as perfect as it seemed. Valerie's sister Vicky later shared in an interview with ABC5 in Phoenix that there were things in Ben's past that cast a shadow over his relationship with Valerie. She didn't go into detail, but she did say that Ben would often reassure Valerie that he had everything under control. Whatever those issues were, they didn't seem to stop Valerie from moving forward with their relationship. She trusted him. She believed in their future. And soon they were taking a major step together. In 1982, Valerie and Ben decided to buy a house, an exciting milestone for any couple. They settled on a newly built Spanish-style home in the South Mountain area of Phoenix, a place where they hoped to build a fresh start. At the same time, Valerie was entering the final year of her electrician apprenticeship. She was on the verge of a breakthrough. Her career was taking off. She had found love again after her divorce, and now she had a new home where she and her daughters could create new memories. Everything seemed to be falling into place. But sometimes the most promising moments in life can be shattered in an instant. Just weeks after moving into their new home, tragedy struck in the most unexpected way. Labor Day weekend of 1982 started like any other holiday for Valerie and her daughters. It was meant to be a day of rest, family time, and simple joys. But by Monday, September 6th, what began as a normal day took a devastating turn. Around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Ben received a phone call that no parent ever wants to get. His 9-year-old daughter from a previous relationship had suffered an epileptic seizure while taking a bath. According to reports, the child's mother had been supervising her, but briefly stepped away. In those few moments, the little girl had a seizure and slipped beneath the water. She was rushed to the hospital where doctors fought to save her, but by the time Ben arrived, it was too late. His daughter had been pronounced dead. While Ben was at the hospital grappling with this unimaginable loss, Valerie and her daughters remained at home, completely unaware of what had just happened. In an era before cell phones, there was no quick way for Valerie to reach Ben. No way to check in or ask what was happening. She could only wait for him to call. Now, what exactly transpired in the Pride home during those next few hours remains a mystery. But what we do know is that at around 9:30 that evening, Valerie spoke on the phone with Ben's brother. That call would be the last known contact she ever had with anyone outside of her home. Over the years, reports have varied about who exactly Valerie was speaking to on the phone that night. Some sources claimed it was a friend, while others believed she was talking to her brother. However, in a more recent interview, Valerie's sister, Vicky, clarified that she was actually on the phone with Ben's brother. According to him, their conversation lasted about 10 minutes. It's likely that he was updating Valerie on what was happening at the hospital with Ben's daughter, but then something interrupted their call. Someone knocked on Valerie's front door. She told Ben's brother that she had to hang up to answer it since Ben wasn't home, and that was the last time anyone heard from her. Neither Valerie nor Ben's brother could have known that this would be the final conversation she would ever have. At around 10 p.m., after spending hours at the hospital, Ben finally returned home, emotionally drained, devastated by the loss of his daughter, and likely just wanting to rest. But as he approached his house, something felt off. The front door was slightly open. That wasn't normal, especially not in the Arizona summer heat when people kept their doors shut to keep the cool air inside. Cautiously, Ben pushed the door open and stepped inside. And what he found was beyond his worst nightmares. Blood everywhere. On a quiet street in South Phoenix, Valerie Pride and her two daughters, Shaidita and Dwena, were murdered. They were brutally repeatedly stabbed inside their living room in very close proximity. His two stepdaughters, 8-year-old Shansha and 4-year-old DWA, lay lifeless in the living room, their small bodies covered in blood. They had been brutally murdered. Just a few feet away near the kitchen, Valerie was also dead, her body drenched in blood. The home they had just moved into, the place where they had hoped to build a new life, had become the scene of an unspeakable massacre. Ben's screams pierced the night. Overcome with horror, he collapsed, wailing so loudly that neighbors rushed outside, trying to understand what was happening. It was they who called the police, as Ben was too inconsolable to do anything but grieve. For any parent, losing a child is a pain that words cannot describe. But to lose a child and then return home to find your entire family slaughtered, it was unfathomable. When the police arrived, even seasoned officers struggled to process what they were seeing. Many described it as the most horrifying crime scene they had ever encountered. Blood covered the floors, the walls. It was everywhere. One detective speaking to the Arizona Republic described it simply. "My God, it's terrible in there. There are stabbings everywhere." Stabbings are already some of the most violent types of murders, but when children are involved, the horror is magnified. The two little girls were found huddled together in the living room near a love seat. They were still in their pajamas, meaning they had likely been preparing for bed when the attack happened. Valerie, on the other hand, was found in the dining area close to the kitchen. Her body was just feet away from the back door, as if she had been trying to escape. All three victims had been stabbed multiple times. Reports later revealed that one of the girls had been brutally mutilated. Strangely, there were no signs of forced entry. This meant that the killer had either been invited in or had somehow entered without breaking in. It wasn't until police learned about the knock on the door during Valerie's last phone call that they began piecing together a chilling possibility. Whoever had knocked that night may have been the person responsible for this unimaginable crime. And just as disturbingly, the murderer hadn't lingered in the house. Investigators determined that after the killings, the suspect had escaped through the back door and jumped over the fence, disappearing into the night. Now, the killings were initially thought to be a robbery gone wrong, but that theory was quickly shattered. There was no sign of forced entry, no stolen belongings, nothing to suggest a break-in. Instead, what lay before them was a scene of unimaginable carnage. Someone had entered that house with one purpose, and that is to kill. But who would want to murder a young mother and her little girls in such a savage manner? That was the question burning in the minds of investigators, and they knew time was not on their side. A killer was out there, and they had to find them before they struck again. That night, the neighborhood was silent, but someone had heard something. As police canvassed the area, one neighbor admitted to catching the sound of a heated argument coming from the Pride home around 4 to 10, but they had dismissed it as just another family dispute. When they peeked outside, they saw nothing. No stranger lurking, no commotion, nothing that screamed danger. And then, an hour later, at around 11 o'clock, Valerie's ex-husband, Jimmy Pride, arrived at the house. When officers broke the news that his daughters had been murdered, he collapsed on the pavement. His anguish screams ripping through the night just like Ben's. He was inconsolable, thrashing, sobbing uncontrollably. The pain was unbearable, and officers had to physically restrain him as he broke down. Now, as mentioned earlier, behind the house on the wooden fence was a bloody handprint. It was undeniable proof that the murderer had escaped by scaling the fence, vanishing into the darkness, slipping through the yard of an abandoned home nearby. But whose handprint was it? And what kind of monster was capable of such a savage act? The investigation took an even darker turn when detectives realized the Pride family had only recently moved into the neighborhood. They had been there for just a few weeks, barely long enough to make friends, let alone enemies. No one truly knew them. And yet, someone had wanted them dead. Desperate for answers, detectives shifted their focus to Valerie's life, digging into her social circles, family ties, and any hint of an enemy in the shadows. But the deeper they searched, the more unsettling the truth became. Because there was nothing. Valerie had no history of conflicts, no bitter feuds, no past that suggested a violent end. She was a devoted mother living an ordinary life, and yet someone had shattered that life in the most gruesome way possible. Then came the autopsy results confirming that all three victims had been stabbed multiple times. The attack was frenzied, brutal, but there was one detail that stood out. None of them had been sexually assaulted. That ruled out one possible motive, but it didn't bring them any closer to the truth. With every passing day, the case grew colder, the unanswered questions piling up, and naturally, the town was gripped by fear. On September 10, 1982, Valerie and her daughters were laid to rest, but their funerals were anything but peaceful. A dark cloud hung over the community. A terrifying realization that a killer was still out there walking free. Then, detectives uncovered a bizarre lead. A month before the murders, Valerie and her husband Ben's home had been broken into. At first, it seemed like a standard burglary, but the details were anything but normal. The intruder hadn't just ransacked the house. They had slashed the water bed in the couple's room. Even more disturbingly, they had taken Valerie's clothes and dumped them into the water. It was personal. This wasn't a thief looking for valuables. This was someone with a grudge, someone who wanted to send a message. Could this have been a warning? Had Valerie unknowingly crossed paths with someone dangerous? Investigators desperately tried to connect the dots, but once again, the case hit a dead end. Whoever had done it had vanished without a trace. As months passed, promising leads turned to dust. Hundreds of tips poured in, each offering the hope of a breakthrough, but none led detectives any closer to the truth. The case, once burning with urgency, began to grow cold. And as it did, the rumors started. Whispers spread through the town. Theories emerging like shadows in the night. But one stood out among the rest. A chilling suggestion that the murders might be connected to the tragic death of Ben's daughter. Some believed Valerie and her daughters had been killed as part of a twisted act of revenge. Ben's 9-year-old daughter had died under tragic circumstances, and some speculated that someone blamed Valerie. But when investigators revisited the case, the truth was clear. The child had suffered an epileptic seizure and drowned. The autopsy confirmed it. There was no evidence of foul play, no reason to believe her death had been anything more than a devastating accident. But still, the rumors persisted, feeding the town's paranoia. As the 1-year anniversary of the murders approached, detectives found themselves no closer to solving the case than when they had first begun. The brutal slaying of Valerie and her daughters had shaken the whole town to its core. Yet, despite relentless efforts, investigators were still chasing shadows. A reward of $2,000 was being offered by the union Valerie worked for along with the Silent Witness program, but not a single lead had brought them closer to the truth. Then in August of 1983, the case took a shocking turn. Police announced an arrest. This news sent a ripple through the town, raising hopes that justice was finally within reach. But what stunned everyone even more was the suspect, a 14-year-old high school student. Detectives also revealed that they were also searching for 2 additional suspects, another juvenile and an adult, whom they believed had played a role in the murders. The Arizona Republic newspaper reported that police suspected the killings were an act of revenge for the death of Ben's daughter, a theory that had once been whispered about but never confirmed. The arrested teenager was allegedly a relative of the little girl who had died. Could someone have blamed Valerie for the child's death? Had resentment festered into something dark and violent? The very thought was horrifying, but the theory itself raised more questions than answers. If Ben's daughter's death had been ruled an accident, why would someone hold Valerie responsible? And if revenge was truly the motive, why murder her daughters as well? It didn't make sense. Even the investigators had their doubts. But just as quickly as it seemed they had found a motive, the case fell apart. Within 24 hours of the arrest, the 14-year-old was released. The district attorney refused to press charges, stating that more investigation was needed. Whatever evidence detectives had, it wasn't strong enough to hold up in court. The other 2 potential suspects never arrested, no charges, no answers. And just like that, the case that had briefly flickered back to life went cold. Once again. 2 years after this, a neighbor made a startling discovery. A knife buried in a backyard. It was eerily similar in size and shape to the one believed to have been used in the murders. Investigators wasted no time, sending it to the crime lab, hoping this could finally be the break they needed. Maybe after all this time, they had found the murder weapon. But once again, hope turned to heartbreak. The knife was tested for DNA, but there was nothing. No trace of Valerie, Shantia, or Duana. Another dead end. Another roadblock in a case that seemed destined to remain a mystery. As the years stretched into decades, detectives refused to let the case go cold. They combed through every shred of evidence, spoke to more than 1,000 people, and chased down every lead. Yet, they still couldn't pinpoint the killer or their motive. By 2012, investigators admitted they had exhausted every avenue. They needed the public's help. Someone out there had to know something. They remained convinced that this was a deeply personal crime, that whoever had done this had entered the Pride family's home just to murder them. And now more than 4 decades have passed since that horrific night. The mystery remains unsolved. The brutal murder of Valerie, Shantia, and Duana still lingers like a ghost over the community, an open wound that refuses to heal. Investigators believe that someone close to Valerie holds the key to unlocking the truth. But how could a person capable of such savagery go on living as if nothing had happened? Did they feel guilt? Did they ever fear getting caught? Or had they convinced themselves they had gotten away with murder? In recent years, with advancements in forensic technology, detectives have begun re-examining evidence. DNA found at the crime scene has been submitted into the national database, raising the possibility that a breakthrough may still come. But even if the killer is eventually unmasked, no explanation will ever make sense. There is no justification for the slaughter of an innocent mother and her 2 young daughters. This crime was the very definition of senseless. Valerie, Shantia, and Duana did not deserve what happened to them. And no matter how much time has passed, one thing remains certain. Anyone who could commit such an unspeakable act deserves to be brought to justice. Story 5. The Jacobson family had everything: wealth, success, and a beautiful home in Wellington, Florida. From the outside, they were the picture of a perfect, loving family. But if there's one thing we've learned, it's that appearances can be deceiving. Beneath the surface, hidden behind the walls of their dream home, was a story far darker than anyone could have imagined. And on what should have been a joyful birthday celebration for these 2 little boys, everything unraveled in the most heartbreaking way, leaving a tragedy so profound that the entire nation would never forget their names. And trust me when I say this is the kind of case that will stay with you for days, leaving you with one haunting question. What kind of father could pull the trigger on his own family? To truly understand the story, we have to go back to 1989 when Neil Mason Jacobson first met Frankie Susoff. Their paths crossed at a gym in Bayside, Queens, New York, where they both lived and worked at the time. From the very beginning, they seemed like the perfect match, both ambitious, successful, and thriving in their careers. Frankie was making a name for herself at the prestigious Lehman Brothers, a powerhouse in the financial world, while Neil had already built his own boutique firm on Long Island. They were young, driven, and on the path to what many would call the American dream. Those who knew them spoke highly of their relationship, describing it as one built on deep admiration and affection. Frankie was completely devoted to Neil, and in return, he was seen as the charismatic, kind-hearted man who had everything going for him. Within his family and social circle, he was often regarded as the golden boy, intelligent, charming, and seemingly unstoppable. He had a way of making things work, and to everyone around him, he and Frankie appeared to be the perfect couple. It wasn't long before they took the next step, getting married and settling into Neil's home in New Jersey. Their transition into married life was effortless. Neil continued to grow his career in mortgage banking, eventually launching his own mortgage brokerage firm, while Frankie remained dedicated to her work in finance. Together, they built a comfortable and fulfilling life filled with shared passions and adventures. They were the kind of couple who did everything together: bicycling, scuba diving, weekend getaways to the countryside, creating memories that only strengthened their bond. From the outside looking in, they had it all. But despite their seemingly perfect marriage, there was one thing missing: children. They longed to start a family. But the journey to parenthood was not an easy one. For years, they faced the devastating reality of infertility. Enduring the exhausting process of multiple fertility treatments, each one bringing a wave of hope and heartbreak. It was an emotional battle, but they refused to give up. Finally, after years of waiting and struggling, their prayers were answered. In 2003, when they welcomed twin boys Joshua and Eric. Already blessed with a comfortable life, Frankie and Neil were happier than they had ever imagined. Their family felt whole and they were thriving in both their personal and professional lives. However, there was another lingering challenge: distance. Neil's parents, Harold and Goldie Jacobson, had moved from New Jersey to Florida in the year 2000. And while they enjoyed their new home, they deeply missed being close to their son and his growing family. They often voiced their frustration about the separation, wishing they could spend more time with their grandchildren. By 2005, life took an unexpected turn for the Jacobson family when Harold was diagnosed with cancer. His condition worsened quickly, making travel to New Jersey impossible. This became a breaking point for Neil. The thought of being so far from his father during such a critical time was unbearable. Without hesitation, he made a firm decision. He was moving his family to Florida to be closer to his parents. But even before the move, Neil had already started investing in Florida real estate. He had purchased a pre-construction investment condo in Lantana, and not long after, he bought another. Real estate became somewhat of an obsession for him, and soon he found himself purchasing a third pre-construction condo. He knew he was overextending financially, but the allure of the booming market kept him going. Frankie, on the other hand, was skeptical. She voiced her concerns, questioning the practicality of his growing investments. But Neil was determined. His mind was set and nothing was going to change it. With his properties piling up in Florida, Neil began pushing Frankie to relocate. She was resistant, hesitant to leave behind the life they had built in New Jersey. She loved their home, their community, and the stability they had created. But as time passed, the financial strain of maintaining their New Jersey home became overwhelming. The mortgage was becoming too much to handle, and eventually Frankie reluctantly agreed to the move. The Jacobsons officially settled in Florida, eager to start a new chapter close to family. However, things did not go as planned. Neil had hoped to sell their New Jersey home before the move, but the market wasn't in his favor. With no other choice, he decided to list it for rent, hoping it would at least generate some income. But just 2 months after they arrived in Florida, tragedy struck. Harold Jacobson passed away. The loss of his father devastated Neil in ways he hadn't expected. He had uprooted his entire life to be closer to Harold, only to lose him so soon after arriving. The grief weighed heavily on him, and his mother, Goldie, later revealed that Neil had struggled with his mental health from a young age. She recalled that as a teenager, he had been diagnosed with obsessive-impulsive disorder, an issue that had plagued him for years. Doctors had noted that Neil had an overwhelming desire to be the perfect child, a pressure that had followed him into adulthood. As the years passed, his struggles with anxiety only grew, and soon things took an even darker turn. The Great Recession hit Florida hard, and Neil, who worked as a mortgage broker, found himself in an increasingly difficult situation. The real estate market collapsed, and the once thriving business that had allowed him to invest so freely was now crumbling beneath him. The financial security he had worked so hard to build was slipping away, and as the weight of his losses grew heavier, so did the cracks in his once stable world. The Florida condos he had invested in before relocating were quickly turning into a financial nightmare. Burdened with subprime mortgages, their payments increased month after month, stretching his resources thin. At first, Neil had convinced himself that things would turn around. He had always been a problem solver, always found a way to make things work. But this time, no amount of determination could keep the walls from closing in. With little to no work coming in, and 4 separate mortgages draining their finances, the pressure became unbearable. At first, Neil and Frankie tried to hold on, dipping into their savings to stay afloat. But as time passed, their financial situation only worsened. Bills piled up. Debt collectors began calling. And the stress of trying to keep everything together was pushing Neil to his limits. Desperate for a solution, he started making risky financial decisions. One bad choice after another. Each one digging them deeper into a hole. He chased after risky investments, sought out loans, and even considered selling off what little they had left. All in a futile attempt to stop the inevitable collapse. Eventually, the weight of it all became too much to bear. The financial juggling act had run its course, and Frankie, exhausted and drained, made the painful decision to stop paying the mortgages on their 3 Florida condos. It was a move that felt like surrender, but they had no choice. There was simply no more money left to give. By the year 2008, the pressure of Neil's business failures had begun to take a serious toll on his health. At first, it started with minor complaints, aches, and pains that he couldn't quite explain. But as time went on, his symptoms worsened. He became sluggish, struggling to muster the energy for even the most basic tasks. His body felt heavy, his mind clouded. There were random bouts of dizziness that left him feeling unstable, and he found himself unable to focus the way he used to. Concerned, he visited the family doctor, who ordered a blood test in October. The results were troubling. Neil had elevated hormone levels, but there was no immediate explanation for his decline. As the weeks passed, his condition only worsened. The once energetic and determined man was now lethargic, withdrawn, and barely functioning. He was eventually diagnosed with depression and transient peripheral vertigo, a condition that further contributed to his constant dizziness. In an attempt to help him cope, his doctor prescribed Zoloft, a common antidepressant. Neil, desperate to feel better, took the medication as prescribed, hoping it would offer some relief. But instead of improving, his mental state deteriorated further. A few days after starting Zoloft, he was called back to the doctor's office where they added a prescription for Xanax. It was meant to ease his anxiety, but his family and friends quickly noticed that something wasn't right. Instead of stabilizing his mood, the medication seemed to send him spiraling even further into darkness. His paranoia intensified. His emotions became more erratic, and the man they had once known began to fade before their eyes. Neil's sister Deborah became deeply concerned about her brother's rapid decline. She confided in their mother, worried about what he was going through. According to Deborah, Neil had started experiencing terrifying hallucinations. He had grown increasingly paranoid, convinced that someone or something was out to get him. Frankie, his wife, was just as alarmed. She reached out to her own sister, desperate for support. As Neil's behavior became more and more disturbing, he had completely withdrawn from the world. He refused to go outside, stopped engaging with friends and family, and even neglected his own hygiene. There were days when he wouldn't even shower, lost in a haze of fear and depression. His paranoia took a terrifying turn when he became obsessed with the idea that the FBI was watching him. He was convinced that federal agents were surveilling him, gathering evidence to have him arrested. He would talk about it constantly, warning anyone who would listen, that they were building a case against him. His delusions became more elaborate. He was certain that his phone was tapped, that his home was under surveillance, that at any moment the authorities would storm in and take him away. His mother saw the full extent of his paranoia. One of the last times she visited him, Neil had pulled her aside, his voice shaking with fear. He told her he was in big trouble. He insisted that the FBI was coming for him, that he had done something terrible, though he couldn't seem to explain exactly what. The fear in his eyes was real, raw, and overwhelming. But before we continue, I need to ask you something. Cases like this, where someone leaves behind a trail of warning signs before doing the unthinkable, are more common than we'd like to admit. We've covered story after story where red flags were everywhere, yet somehow no one managed to stop the disaster before it happened. So, if you ever noticed someone you knew showing these signs, acting strangely, withdrawing, saying things that just don't sit right, what would you do? Would you step in? Would you know what to say? I really want to hear your thoughts on this. Now, back to the story. As Neil Jacobson's mind unraveled, so did his grip on reality. And on that fateful day, January 23, 2010, the darkness he had been wrestling with for months finally took over. And what happened next would shock everyone who had ever known him. That morning, Neil stood before his wardrobe, fumbling with the top shelf, his hands shaking as he retrieved a loaded gun. His wife, Frankie, still groggy from sleep, watched in confusion. not yet realizing the horror that was unfolding before her. Neil, with the gun in hand, stepped out of the wardrobe, his face hardening into something almost unrecognizable. Frankie's heart skipped a beat as the realization hit her. He wasn't holding the gun to defend himself. He was holding it with purpose. In an instant, panic took over. She leapt toward him, struggling desperately to wrest the weapon from his grasp. They tumbled to the floor to fight a chaotic blur of screams, desperation, and tears. In the midst of the struggle, Neil, in a violent frenzy, struck Frankie, knocking out her front tooth and slicing her finger. Despite the brutality of it all, Frankie didn't give up. She fought with all her strength, but Neil was too much, overpowering her in his disturbed state. With cold detachment, he stood, reloaded the gun, and turned the weapon on her. 2 shots rang out, one after another, each striking her in the face, silencing her forever. But Neil's twisted path didn't end there. Covered in Frankie's blood, he reloaded the gun and made his way to his son Eric's room. Eric, who had been lying on his stomach in peaceful sleep, was the next victim in the nightmare that Neil had somehow constructed in his mind. 2 bullets tore through Eric's body, but against all odds, the boy survived the first 2 shots. But Neil was undeterred, his mind fixated on finishing what he had started. He grabbed a pillow and pressed it over Eric's face, ensuring his son wouldn't survive. 2 more shots and Eric was gone. The house was eerily still now as Neil moved toward the next room where his youngest son, Joshua, was sleeping. Joshua, blissfully unaware of the carnage around him, lay curled in his sheets. Neil's actions were methodical, almost as if he were following a script. He covered his son's face with a pillow, silencing him with 2 shots to the face. In a matter of moments, the vibrant life of his family had been extinguished. With the blood of his wife and children staining his hands, Neil walked to the bathroom and turned on the shower. He stood under the water, numb as if washing away the sins he could no longer escape. When the shower ended, he dressed, swallowed a cocktail of Vicodin and Xanax, and in a haze left his home. As he drove, the pills began to take effect, making him groggy and disoriented. Less than a mile from his mother's house, Neil passed out. Behind the wheel, swerving off the road and coming to a stop in the grass. In the confusion, Neil had initially planned to kill his mother, Goldie, next before taking his own life. But in his twisted state, something inside him held him back. He later told the police that when he was at home standing in the living room, he thought about going to heaven to be with his father, but he couldn't leave his mother alone, so he planned to take her with him. Thankfully, he never made it to her house. When the police found him, Neil was disoriented, barely conscious, and gripping the gun beside him. As they approached, he muttered, "I killed my family," in a dazed, broken voice. The investigation raised many questions. Was Neil a victim of the side effects of his medications? Or had he planned this horrific act all along? A suicide note found later suggested that Neil may have been preparing for this moment, leaving many to wonder whether he was driven by his medications or if he had at some point simply snapped. And as what you might expect, from the very beginning, Neil's defense centered around his mental state. His attorneys argued that He had been suffering from severe depression, anxiety, and paranoia, all of which had been worsened by the medications he was taking. They described a man overwhelmed by financial ruin, haunted by the fear that the FBI was watching him, and convinced that there was no way out. His legal team insisted that he had not acted out of hatred or rage, but had instead been driven to an unimaginable breaking point due to the side effects of his prescription drugs. To support their argument, the defense brought in medical experts who testified about the dangers of Zoloft and Xanax, the two medications Neil had been prescribed before the murders. These drugs, they explained, could cause extreme mood swings, hallucinations, and suicidal tendencies, especially when taken together in high doses. Neil's behavior before the killings, his paranoia, delusions, and refusal to leave the house, was presented as clear evidence that he had lost his grip on reality. His lawyers pushed the narrative that Neil had been a loving father and husband, a man who had never shown any signs of violence before, making it hard to believe that he had killed his family intentionally. But the prosecution had a different story to tell. They painted Neil not as a victim of medication, but as a desperate man who had methodically planned the murders. They argued that his financial troubles had reached a boiling point and that instead of facing them, he had chosen to take his family's lives in an act of ultimate control. They pointed to the way he had executed the killings, retrieving his gun, reloading it multiple times, and ensuring that no one survived. To them, this was not the act of a man lost in a haze of confusion, but one who had made a deliberate and calculated decision. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence against Neil was the suicide note found in his home. The note indicated that he had thought through his actions and accepted what he was about to do. It wasn't the frantic scribblings of someone in the middle of a psychotic episode. It was organized, reflective, and in the prosecution's view, proof of premeditation. If he had truly been unaware of his actions, why would he have left behind such a message? The prosecution also called witnesses to testify about Neil's behavior leading up to the murders. His sister Deborah had noticed a dramatic shift in his personality. He had become increasingly paranoid, talking about the FBI coming to arrest him. His wife, Frankie, had confided in her sister that Neil was no longer the man she had married. He had stopped showering, refused to leave the house, and seemed trapped in his own mind. While the defense used these accounts to argue that Neil was suffering from a mental breakdown, the prosecution used them to show that there had been warning signs. Signs that should have led Neil to seek professional help instead of resorting to murder. Neil's mother, Goldie, also played a heartbreaking role in the trial. She had been one of the last people to see him before the tragedy. When she recalled how Neil had told her, "Mom, I love you no matter what happens," the courtroom fell silent. At the time, she hadn't thought much of it, but in hindsight, it was clear. He had been preparing for what he was about to do. Goldie, who had always seen her son as a kind and loving man, struggled to reconcile the Neil she knew with the one on trial for murder. As the trial progressed, the jury was left to decide whether Neil Jacobson had truly been in a state of drug-induced psychosis, or if he had coldly and deliberately murdered his wife and children. The prosecution emphasized that Neil had made a series of conscious choices: loading his gun, aiming at his loved ones, pulling the trigger multiple times. They argued that no matter what struggles he was facing, Nothing justified what he had done. The defense, on the other hand, urged the jury to consider his mental state, to see him as a broken man who had been consumed by fear, paranoia, and desperation. After days of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict: guilty on all counts. The judge, while acknowledging the tragedy of the situation, made it clear that no level of financial distress or mental illness excused the murder of innocent children and a devoted wife. Neil Jacobson was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His fate was sealed, and the courtroom was filled with an overwhelming sense of loss. Victor and Tiffany Neil Jacobson reached a plea deal with the state. He changed his plea of not guilty to guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder. Now, after killing his family, he tried to kill himself. In fact, even leaving behind a suicide note detailing why he did it. He said the reason was the family's mounting financial situation. Now, he's going to spend the rest of his life behind bars. Neil Jacobson answered to the judge in this Palm Beach County courtroom today, admitting that he shot his wife, Frankie, and then shot their twin 7-year-old sons while they were asleep in their Wellington home back in 2010. But when it was the family's turn to speak in court, Neil held his head and never looked up. There's not a day that goes by that I don't hear my sister saying, "Good morning, Sherry. Good morning, Sherry. What are you doing today? What did you eat for breakfast today? Good morning, Robin. How are you?" Even after the trial ended, many questions remained. Could this tragedy have been prevented if Neil had received a different treatment? Were the medications to blame? Or was he simply a man who refused to face his failures? No one could say for certain. What was undeniable, however, was that a mother and 2 young boys had lost their lives in the most horrific way possible, and nothing could ever undo that. Now, I want to hear your thoughts. Story 6. At first glance, this house might seem like nothing more than an old abandoned building. But trust me, the deeper we dig into today's case, the more you'll realize that this very house, with its piles of garbage scattered around, was the scene of some of the most monstrous murders that took place back in 1987. While the case was officially left unsolved, many, including law enforcement, have their suspicions about who the true culprit really is. So, if you've ever wondered why this case remains one of the town's darkest mysteries, stay with us till the very end. The truth might just shock you and you'll be left questioning everything you thought you knew. To kick things off, let's talk about the family that lived in the house, the Coons family. They were a quiet, reclusive bunch, practically unknown to the outside world. Despite living in a town with fewer than 1,000 people, the family had always kept to themselves. But little did anyone know, the small, peaceful town of Athens, Wisconsin, would soon be shaken to its core by a tragedy no one could have predicted. Not only would the brutal murder of the Coons family leave the town in shock, but it would also reveal some incredibly strange and unsettling details that would haunt people for years to come. Now, as mentioned earlier, the Coons family lived a life of isolation and struggle in a run-down farmhouse far from the hustle and bustle of the nearest town. They called a piece of land in Athens home, 108 acres to be exact, about 6 miles from the town itself. Their home, though secluded, was a far cry from a cozy haven. It was falling apart just like their life. The family was made up of several members. Helen, age 70, Clarence 76, Irene 81. Marie 72, Randy 30, and Kenneth 55. Helen, Clarence, Irene, and Marie were siblings while Randy and Kenneth were Helen's children. This family didn't have much contact with anyone outside their household. They stuck to themselves, keeping their world small and tight-knit. In fact, Kenneth was the only one who ever ventured outside of the family circle. He worked at the Kraft Incorporated cheese factory as a milk pasteurizer, a job he'd held for 35 years. He was the only one who had regular contact with people outside the home. Everyone else pretty much kept to themselves with no friends or acquaintances to speak of. Even with their reclusive lifestyle, there was a certain sense of normality to their lives. Until one fateful day. On the morning of July 5, 1987, Kenneth returned home from work, expecting the usual quiet morning with his family. But instead, what he found would leave him and the entire town of Athens reeling in disbelief. As he entered the house, Kenneth found his entire family dead, brutally murdered in their own home. His Aunt Marie was lying lifeless in the entrance doorway, as if she had tried to escape, but never made it. Randy, his cousin, was found on the kitchen floor, his body bearing clear signs of a violent struggle. Irene, another aunt, sat slumped in a chair, motionless. And Clarence, the elderly family patriarch, was found in his bed as if he'd been caught unaware in his sleep. The murderers showed no mercy. Each one of them had been shot in the head, execution style, with a .22 caliber gun. 8 spent casings and several fired bullets littered the home, confirming the brutal efficiency of the killers. But there was something else that struck investigators as odd. Near the garden on the property, they found tire impressions that didn't belong to any vehicle known to be associated with the family. And perhaps the most chilling discovery of all was the absence of Helen, Kenneth's mother. She was nowhere to be found. Had she been taken, or was there something more sinister at play? When the authorities arrived and began their investigation, they couldn't help but take note of the Coons family's less than ideal living conditions. The house, which had seen better days, was in desperate need of repairs. There was no running water, and the family lacked many modern conveniences that most people took for granted. The only things they had to entertain themselves were a television and a VCR. Their primary means of warmth and cooking came from a wood-burning stove, which was the center of their daily life. But what struck investigators even more was the state of the house. It was filthy with trash scattered in every corner, giving it a striking resemblance to a hoarder's home. But it didn't end there. As the investigators continued their search, they stumbled upon something even more bizarre. An overwhelming number of adult videos and magazines scattered throughout the house. It seemed out of place, especially in a home so disorganized. But what caught the attention of the authorities the most wasn't the state of the house. It was the money they found in plain sight. Around $20,000 in cash was lying around the house, seemingly abandoned. The question on everyone's mind was clear. Who were the Coons family really? And why was there so much cash just left out in the open? Now, the deeper investigators dug, the more they uncovered about the troubled past of the Coons family. their history seemed to be riddled with violence and tragedy. It all began with their parents, Anna and Ignat, in 1905. At that time, they were living with Ignat's mother, Mary. One day, Anna came home to a horrific discovery. Her brother, Wendell, had brutally bludgeoned their mother to death in her bed. Wendell was swiftly sent to a mental institution. But that wasn't the end of the family's dark history. It turned out that Wendell wasn't the only one with mental health struggles. Ignat had another brother who had already been admitted to a mental institution long before the murder. Mental illness seemed to be a recurring issue within the family, with a history of violence and instability that stretched back generations. As the investigation continued, all eyes initially turned to Kenneth, since he was the one who had found the bodies. But Kenneth was quickly cleared thanks to a solid alibi. Despite his low IQ and shy nature, Kenneth explained to the police the best he could what had happened, though he struggled to make sense of the horrifying scene. The investigation also uncovered another strange detail. On July 4, 1987, a family member named Jermaine Peter, who didn't live with the Coons family, came by to visit for a picnic. What did this visit have to do with the murders? Was it merely a family gathering, or could Jermaine have known something that the police needed to hear? Kenneth told the police that he had been with his family until around 8 o'clock in the night. After spending time with them, he decided to go out and work in the garden. He stayed there until about 10 o'clock at night, tilling the soil quietly while the rest of the house settled in for the evening. When he was done, instead of going back inside, Kenneth said he chose to head to his workplace, which was roughly 3 miles away, to wash his car. Apparently, this was something he did often. After he finished cleaning his car, Kenneth said he made a stop to buy some fireworks somewhere between the factory and a nearby bar, where he later decided to hang out for a while. Rather than heading straight back home, he chose to sleep in his car for the night. According to his statement, he returned home around 5 o'clock in the morning the next day, only to walk into a nightmare. The sheriff working the case estimated that the murders likely occurred sometime between 10:30 and 11 o'clock that night. Although they hadn't yet received the official time of death from the coroner. One odd detail was that Ree's car had been found parked near the garden, an unusual spot, Kenneth claimed, because Randy never parked there. Investigators also noted that the mysterious tire impressions found near the garden didn't match Kenneth's car at all. With hardly any evidence to go on, and the house offering more confusion than clues, the police turned their focus to the most obvious mystery. Helen, the missing family member. At that point, no one was sure whether she had been kidnapped, escaped, or was somehow involved. Kenneth insisted that his mother would never leave on her own. She didn't like going to town by herself, and in fact, it was always Randy who drove her when she needed something. He'd wait in the car while she took care of whatever errands she had. Jermaine, Helen's sister, told authorities that Helen didn't behave any differently on the day of the picnic. She wasn't nervous or acting suspicious. If Helen had been planning something, Jermaine believed, she would have shown at least a hint of anxiety, but there was nothing. Still, the theory that Helen might have had something to do with the killing started to gain momentum, especially after a couple named Gail and David Weiler stepped forward with something strange to share. They owned Weiler's hardware store in town, and about 3 weeks before the murders, Helen had come in to order a toaster. While she was there, she also bought a box of .22 caliber bullets. According to Gail, Helen was usually a kind, soft-spoken woman. But on that particular day, she was different. She seemed angry, even bitter. She started complaining about her family, saying all they did was sit around all day watching dirty movies together. Gail remembered how Helen clenched her teeth as she spoke, her tone filled with frustration. Helen claimed she was buying the bullets for Randy, supposedly to take care of some blackbirds that had been bothering them on the property. At the time, Gail didn't think much of it. Sure, the interaction was a little odd, but nothing that screamed danger. That is, until news of the gruesome murder spread. By that following Monday, Gail had contacted the police and told them everything. The police did eventually find a rifle in the house that matched the caliber of the bullets Helen had purchased. But, oddly enough, the barrel was filled with cobwebs, suggesting it hadn't been used in quite a long time. Even with so many unanswered questions and people unsure whether Helen had been a victim or the mastermind, the local community held on to hope. They came together to form search parties, created t-shirts and buttons with her name and face, and rallied behind the effort to find her. That hope, however, turned into heartbreak. 9 months after the murders, Helen's body was discovered about 19 miles from the family's home. Her remains were found in a frozen creek. Just like the others, she had been shot in the head. This discovery brought a flood of new questions that left investigators and the entire town grappling with a mystery even darker than before. And the biggest question was chilling. Had Helen been held captive for months and then killed in retaliation? And if so, by who and why? There had always been strange and disturbing rumors swirling around the Coons family. People whispered that the family was not only unusually close, but might have been involved in inappropriate and romantic relationships within their own bloodline. These rumors had followed the family like a shadow for decades, stretching back all the way to the year 1933 when a then 15-year-old Helen became pregnant with her first child, Kenneth. Helen had claimed at the time that she had been molested by a nearby farmer named Frank Gums. Frank was eventually convicted and sent to prison, but not everyone believed her. The whispers in town told a different story, one that pointed fingers not at an outsider, but at Helen's own brother, Clarence. The bond between Helen and Clarence was unusually strong, and many believed Clarence was actually Kenneth's biological father. That suspicion wasn't limited to town gossip, either. Kenneth himself admitted he had been told more than once that Clarence was his real dad. The questions didn't end there. Kenneth said he also suspected Clarence might have been the father of Randy as well, since Ree's birth certificate had no father listed at all. But at the end of the day, Kenneth confessed he truly didn't know whether him or his brother. And that uncertainty only added more fuel to the already bizarre and disturbing theories. As if that weren't unsettling enough, it was also reported that Helen and Randy, her son, shared a bed together in the same room. Meanwhile, Clarence, Irene, and Marie were said to have slept in the living room. The idea that Helen slept so closely with her grown son while the rest of the family was separated raised even more eyebrows and made the whispers around town grow louder. Many people had long dismissed Helen's original claims of assault. Investigators wondered if her eventual murder might have been the result of years of scorn, isolation, and pent-up rage, maybe even a final punishment from someone who saw her as the cause of shame and scandal. But put yourself in the shoes of the investigators back then. If you were one of the cops working this bizarre and unsettling case, would you really believe that Helen, a woman with no criminal record and a tragic past, could have orchestrated the cold-blooded murder of her entire family? I genuinely want to know what you think. But the theories didn't stop at the family's complicated dynamics. Another possible motive began to emerge, and that is drugs. At the time, Ariel had been struggling with a serious drug problem, and Randy soon came under suspicion. During later investigations, a witness actually came forward and admitted they had purchased drugs from Randy. That revelation opened the door to another terrifying possibility: that the entire massacre might have been the result of a drug deal gone wrong. Ree's body did show signs of physical assault, hinting that whatever happened to him might have involved a struggle. Despite the Coons family's reclusive lifestyle, police did manage to identify someone outside the family who had interacted with them in the past. A 21-year-old farmer named Chris Jacobs III. His only known connection to the Coons family was that he had bought a car from them. Still, Jacobs had a reputation around town for being a troublemaker and a thief. Since the surviving family members had been ruled out as suspects, and Jacobs was one of the very few people to have any contact with them, the police began to zero in on him. Even though the only physical evidence tying Chris to the scene was a tire track that happened to match his car, investigators still pushed forward. There was no solid forensic proof, no fingerprints, no DNA. No witnesses placing him at the scene during the time of the murders. And yet, despite the lack of hard evidence, authorities charged him with 5 counts of murder. His trial began on October 28, 1989. But despite the shocking charges, the case quickly began to unravel. There was simply not enough evidence to convict him. The entire case had been built on circumstantial details, and without anything concrete tying Jacobs to the crime scene, he was acquitted on all 5 counts. For a while, it seemed like that was the end of the road, another cold case slipping into silence. But just 4 years later, something unexpected happened. Right before the statute of limitations was set to expire, Jacobs was charged again. This time, not for murder, but for the kidnapping and false imprisonment of Helen. Jacobs fought back hard, arguing that these new charges violated his constitutional protections against double jeopardy, which prevents someone from being tried twice for the same crime. He even tried to take his case to the Supreme Court, but they refused to hear it. His second trial began on June 8, 1998, and lasted for 2 tense weeks. This time, prosecutors argued that Jacobs had killed the entire Coon family, kidnapped Helen, held her captive for months, and then murdered her, too. But their entire case hinged on one person, Jacobs' ex-girlfriend, Stacy Weiss, who came forward with information in June of 1993. According to Stacy Weiss, Chris Jacobs had made a chilling confession long before any charges were filed. She told investigators that it happened during what seemed like a normal drive home from a pool league night. Out of nowhere, Jacobs asked her how she would feel if he turned out to be the person responsible for the gruesome Counts family murders. Before she could even process the question, Jacobs allegedly confessed calmly and without remorse, saying he wanted to prove to himself that he was a man. That was his reason, his motive, just to feel something, to prove something to himself, no matter how monstrous it was. Weiss recounted that Jacobs told her he went to the Coe family home on July 4 when Randy opened the door and let him in. An argument broke out between them. It's unclear what sparked it, but it escalated to the point where Jacobs pulled out a gun and shot Randy. Then, according to Weiss, he decided to eliminate anyone who could tie him to the crime, ending the lives of everyone else in the house. But Helen, for reasons he never fully explained, wasn't killed on the spot. Instead, he tied her up and drove her to a swamp where he ultimately disposed of her. The details were horrific, but they were oddly specific, especially for someone trying to lie. Even more alarming was Weiss's claim that Jacobs had also told this same story to the district attorney. Allegedly, the DA wrote down Jacobs' confession, had him sign it, and sealed it in an envelope. Whether that envelope still exists or ever did is another mystery in this already twisted tale. Naturally, the defense tore into Weiss's credibility. They painted her as someone with a personal agenda, pointing out her own criminal past, including outstanding robbery charges in another state. They argued that she only came forward to cut herself a better deal. And to be fair, she did receive a plea deal in exchange for her testimony. But the prosecution maintained that regardless of her past, her account matched key pieces of evidence and filled in gaps investigators hadn't been able to close for years. When her story was combined with the already existing circumstantial evidence, it was enough for a jury to convict. After just 4 hours of deliberation, Chris Jacobs was found guilty not of murder, but of the kidnapping and false imprisonment of Helen Counts. It might not have been the original 5 murder charges he once faced, but it was still a significant win for the prosecution. Jacobs was sentenced to 31 years in prison with a mandatory release date set for February 8, 2020. He was also ordered to serve extended supervision until 2029. However, when the time came for his release, Jacobs refused to cooperate with the terms of his parole. He wouldn't sign any paperwork or report to a parole officer. Why? Because according to him, doing so would be the same as admitting guilt, and he wasn't about to confess to something he claimed he didn't do. As a result, Jacobs chose to remain behind bars, serving out the remainder of his sentence. He continues to maintain his innocence to this day. Despite his conviction, the case is still officially listed as unsolved. No one has been conclusively linked to the murder of the Count family and no definitive proof has ever surfaced. Yet, the people of Athens, Wisconsin remain firmly convinced that Jacobs is responsible. The Count family story lives on in local legend, a bizarre and tragic tale marked by rumors of incest, reclusion, and generational trauma. In fact, journalist Crocker Stevenson wrote an entire book about the case titled Blood Relative: Portraits of a Mass Murder, which dives into the history of the family and explores the eerie lineage that surrounded them. But even that book couldn't untangle all the strange rumors that clung to the Count's name. What made this case even more surreal was how the actual murders seemed to take a backseat to the speculation about the family's lifestyle. Many people were more fixated on whether or not Helen's brother, Clarence, had fathered her child, Kenneth, and possibly even Randy, than on who actually committed the murders. Despite years of gossip, no one ever confirmed or denied those rumors. There's no record of DNA testing, and Kenneth passed away in 2001, further reducing the chances that the truth will ever come out. So now all we're left with is a cold case that continues to divide a town. A man who sits in prison clinging to his innocence. And a family whose legacy is forever marked by whispers, unanswered questions, and unthinkable loss. As the rain gently falls and the night grows deeper, thank you for joining me here at Mr. Nightcared. True Crime Stories remind us of life's mysteries and the importance of staying aware even as we seek comfort in the quiet of the night. Let the rain carry you to a peaceful sleep. And until we meet again, stay safe, stay curious, and let the night watch over you.